What's going on, everybody? Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. It's boxing history time, my friends. I'm here with my buddy Eris Pina, who's, of course, CompuBox operator, but my pal in boxing history dumb. We're over here creating shit for these absolute fucking frauds to just copy paste and rip off and call their own. What's up, buddy? How you doing?
Everything's good, my man. Everything's really good.
Yeah, got to take a couple digs. Good to hear
I
that you're
know.
doing all right, though,
Listen, bro. Hopefully, dig deeper sometimes if necessary.
man.
Especially if people, do the shit that they type of do around there with the work you put in. You know what I mean? By all means, take a shovel.
So dumb. So dumb. Anyway, we're here talking boxing history as we usually are, but as we also usually are, trying to relate it to stuff that's contemporary, trying to make it relevant, trying to make people also interested, kind of tying the things that are happening now in boxing to historical aspects of the sport. This weekend, we have a fairly stacked card in Saudi Arabia that is, rattling off the names. There's a lot of them. The card is kind of the card itself is not in jeopardy, but a couple of the bigger fights that were on the card, they seem to be in limbo, if not kind of falling apart. But that's simply the nature of having so many names attached to one particular fight card. So we're talking stacked cards. That's what we're talking.
Yeah, I mean, boxing in history in general, that like boxing's been around for so long that there's been so many stat cards that most people only go back to like the past 30 years when they talk about like stat cards and like cards that be like, oh man, top to bottom, this might be the best card we've ever seen, yada yada yada. But if you go back in history, like you and I have been talking about throughout the week, it's actually been a common theme throughout history, where a lot of big ass names, some all-time greats would appear on the same card there, not some necessarily against the biggest names around, but they would still appear on the same card and just create a huge gate and everything like that, a lot of attention. So,
Yeah, and I mean, there's a long history which we're going to get into in just a moment with these kind of stacked cards and the way that they stack now versus how they kind of used to be stacked back in the day. But yeah, it's basically the name of the game is throwing as much at boxing fans as possible, good or bad. Usually pretty good, but some have not been good. So that being said, actually, I was going to say, uh, just briefly and kind of run down what is happening this weekend. We don't have to go down the whole thing. And again, like I said, not all of it is is set in stone right at this moment. And especially one of the bigger fights on the card, Daniel Dubois versus Joseph Parker, sounds like it was possibly, falling apart. But Artur Beterbiev versus Dmitry Bivol, the rematch between those two, that's the biggie. Thankfully, that sounds like it's all a go. It's for the light heavyweight championship. First fight was fairly close, kind of contentious, and I don't know. I thought the right guy won, but like again, it was close. Got Carlos Adams versus Hamza Shirez, Virgil Ortiz Jr., Israel Madrimov, Zalil Zhang versus Ait Kabel, Joshua Buatsi, Callum Smith, Shakur Stevenson. Fortunately, his fight fell through. He's fighting a dude named Josh Padley. So that's a fairly stacked card, especially by today's standards. Want to give it the credit that it deserves because there, there's always going to be a weird split as far as people supporting one promotion over the other, supporting one network over the other, and stuff like that in today's social media-ized boxing sphere, as it were. So anyway, that's what we're dealing with, and that's why it's rightly called a stacked card.
1,000%. I'm actually working that card this Saturday, and I worked their first card, and I mean, I'm excited for it. You know what I mean? Like you said, top to bottom. Even though the Stevenson fight did fall out, and by all accounts, it looks like the Dubois and Joseph Parker fight, unfortunately, is going to fall off as well because Dubois is unfortunately fallen ill, just like Floyd Schofield did in his fight for with Stevenson. So there looks like there's going to be a late replacement in that fight, but still, even with those two fights being replaced, it's still a stat card with all the names attached to it, and there's still a lot of major competitive fights on it as well. I think most people I think more people would be really sad if, say, like Virgil Ortiz fell out against Madrimov. or something like that. That would be like a fight that everyone is very excited about and be like really bummed that would end up falling apart, for instance. But still, or something would happen in a rematch with Beterbiev or Bivol, that one of them would got injured and the fight would fall off. So still, top to bottom, it's going to be a great card and a very long card, in fact, because I think for us in the US, it's going to start around what, like 11:30 in the morning, and it's not going to culminate until around what, around 7 p.m. or so. It's a long ass day of boxing, bro.
It's a pretty long day of boxing, admittedly. I mean, I will say they've gotten better at handling the pacing of a lot of these cards. It's not perfect, but I think that also, again, giving credit where it is due, that's a lot of moving parts, man. If you're a matchmaker, if you're a promoter, if you're anybody handling this level of show whatsoever, that's a lot of moving parts. And even when you're kind of like a mid or lower level or club level promoter, matchmaker, whatever, not to demean that whatsoever, but that's a lot of work and a lot of personalities to deal with, a lot of fighters who probably think their worth is a lot more than it generally is, et cetera. So, it's tough, and that's just kind of going to be the nature of a lot of cards where you're dealing with that many athletes, I mean, fighters on that level. Some stuff's going to kind of fall apart, and some stuff's not going to go the way that you hoped it did. And one thing we're going to be talking about a lot today is the difference between stacking cards with well matched fights or highly matched fights, elite level fights, etc., versus just stacking cards with names.
1,000%. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So, I mean, I'll just give, I guess, to start it off right now, we can go right into it. You know what I mean? So I was already thinking, like I said, boxing has such a vast history that it can go all the way back when you want to think about a stat card. So I don't know. Here's one card that we've never actually really talked about, I think, on the show. We go back to 1892 when it wasn't on one day in particular, how most cards are always, that's how we known as boxing fans. They've always just been everything just stacked on one show for one day. But this one was spread out over 3 days. And that was when John L. Sullivan defended his heavyweight championship against Jim Corbett. George Dixon defended the first black world champion and one of the greatest fighters in history, defended his bantamweight championship against Jack Skelly. And what was the other one? Jack McCuffley, the lightweight champion, who would end up becoming the first champion, correct me if I'm wrong, to retire undefeated, defending his belt as well.
Which is pretty crazy. I mean, for that time, especially. But I think it's really illustrative of here I go with the history fucking rant here. But basically, it's just illustrative of the difference of what boxing was then versus what it is now, how it was consumed, how it was broadcast, if it was at all. And I mean, it was part of like a festival. It was a big to do in and of itself. And a lot of it's almost kind of like if you were to take the what happened in Kinshasa, and it was a big festival culminated with Ali defeating Foreman, and that kind of like that, except for it's all centered around these fights and much earlier, obviously. And so you kind of similarly during that time, the rise of vaudeville style shows, and also kind of hearkening back to how boxing and other combat sports were spread even before that on kind of like what would be known as kind of like circus or traveling carnival circuits where they would have even heavyweight champions. After they won the title, they would just go participate in a series of exhibitions around the country and travel this circuit. And in some cases, even before they became champion, like barnstorming or whatever that John L. Sullivan was known for. But in some other cases, fighters would travel and do kind of like the U.S. style of like boxing booths where they would challenge all comers and say, like, yeah, if you can knock me down, then you get $5 or something like that. But otherwise, I take your money. And that's how they would make their fucking money. And just like in wrestling, a lot of them were setups and a lot of them would, they would have fall guys and shit like that and stool pigeons and blah, blah, blah. But that's exactly how boxing was consumed and got its start, and how wrestling, and also why those two worlds were so converged at this time. So that being said, you bring up this John L. Sullivan Corbett fight card, which was in the back in the day, John L. Sullivan massively popular. Corbett somewhat popular, not as popular, but probably popular for different reasons. And also a big foil for John L. Sullivan and his kind of rowdy, heavy drinking, more rough around the edges. Frank, let's just call it what it is. The dude got fucking fat. Okay, he's a fat alcoholic. Let's just fucking call it what it was, bro.
Bro, before you go on, I don't mean to cut you up, but let me ask you this question. Can you imagine, because you know Sullivan was always on the circuit, right? Doing like vaudeville tours and just as all the champions did. He was the start of it, basically. But I can just imagine you imagine the fucking drunken hoofings that he would be doing on stage while he would just like, and I don't know if he would, if I don't, I'm pretty sure like a lot of it wasn't him actually performing. It was like him posing and doing things like that, right? But I want to picture as him like actually getting in and trying to like sing and do like a dance and like a jig on stage, you know, like do some type of act. And he's so fucking drunk and he starts stumbling all over the place, starts yelling, just screaming at the audience for like anything. I don't know.
I,
It's just my
I
weird imagination. I could just see I just know it was an absolute fucking seeing that dude perform just being tanked must have been an
e-
absolute fucking shit show.
even as popular as he was, even then, newspapers were like, "Yeah, John L. Sullivan showed up at the fucking opera house the other night. That fool was stinking drunk, falling all over, had to be let out." And it's like he was popular, but they knew he was a fucking alcoholic. And
But
I
I mean,
mean,
it's so popular that they used to say, what was the saying? Shake the hand that shook the hand of John L. Sullivan, right?
yeah, there was a popular jig or like song that they wrote that was the title of the song, and like most of the lyrics was "Let me shake the hand that shook the hand of John L. Sullivan" and shit like that, because he was super popular, and he was probably the first, popular American sportsman. And that being said, that's like again getting back to that's kind of just how boxing was consumed. And with this particular fight, it was hugely popular. And it was also kind of like a step forward in the evolution of fight cards in the sense that we've talked about this on other history shows about how recklessly and last minute and shit like fights were put together. You had to walk through a field, you had to go through mud, you had to get a private invite to somebody's estate because there if you look on I don't think it says so much on BoxRec because it doesn't go back as far on BoxRec, but like Cyber Boxing Zone, there will be like some of the venues listed on there or like private estate and shit like that for some of the fighters because they were literally just invited onto somebody's fucking property to
Yeah.
fight some fucking thing and the audience was like 50 rich fucking people who could afford to just watch these dudes fight, which sounds just weird as fuck, but that's how it was. And so, point being, the evolution being that there were tickets, people were selling tickets to this fight. There was advertisements in the newspaper. There were posters. Some of them are super scarce, but you can find them today still. And that
Oh,
being,
they're on eBay.
yeah, I mean, you can find reproductions too. I'm sure people fooling other people, but that being said, like I said, it was a step forward. A lot was moving forward, and this was really um, the kind of like showing that athletic clubs could host these big boxing festivals and shit like that. So that's big.
Yeah, it was huge, and a lot of athletic clubs started popping up all over the country from there. Mostly, beginning from this fight, and also even before that as well.
Yeah,
Like
the
they're
Olympic Club was
uh,
massively popular in New Orleans.
huge, and that's where I ended up hosting this event. And so, like to think about, like you just said too, with the evolution of the sport, initially, especially in the bare knuckle era, because this is just on the cusp of just leaving that era at this point. Sullivan has always been known as like the champion who ushered in the gloved era because he was the first champion that actually did fight with gloves. In terms of the heavyweight champion that like I mean they had those exhibitions and stuff like that beforehand with glove guys, but like Sullivan was one of the first guys of the proponents of like, no, I'd rather fight with gloves than I would fight just bare knuckle. And with that also the London prize ring rules, which were, the bare knuckle primarily the bare knuckle rules were now invalid, and then that's when the Queensberry, the Marcus Queensberry rules were primarily used after that. So when Sullivan came in, so that was a huge change. And like we've talked about in past shows, that was the way boxing like rapidly evolved from that bare knuckle era once everything kind of changed in the late 1800s to the 1900s is like pretty incredible. And there was still some holdovers from that era. Like Sullivan, after this fight, he retired more or less. There was, a few hints at come back after that, but guys, there were still a few hangers on from the bare knuckle era. Like Bob Fitzsimmons, for instance, was a guy from that era, even though he was closer to the gloved era than he was in the bare knuckle. But I mean, he was still kind of a holdover. Peter Mayer is a better example because he was a guy that was very active in the 1880s and such before still and one of the first fighters that had one of them long ass careers that ended up into like, the early into like the mid 1900s and others like that. But like in just general, this was one of those first events where it was like, wow, this is like the first actual big event where not only is just we're just looking at the heavyweight champion, but there's been other divisions now that have evolved since then and like had actual designated champions. So boxing, like we said, it was just rapidly moving.
Yeah, it actually the way that it evolved right around the time is pretty crazy, and like the how rapidly it evolved.
Yeah.
A lot of those fighters from that era also held over, like you said, Jake Kilrain, Dominic McCaffrey. A lot of those kind of fighters were still around into the early 1900s when boxing was starting to just simply look like a completely different sport altogether. And in the early 1900s, that the remnants of like the wrestling and tussling and stuff like that were almost totally weeded out, or at least being weeded out
Mhm.
and a little bit less popular than they used to be. So yeah, there's absolutely no question. And I think that it's also interesting. We were talking about this the other day, and this is also what I brought up when we were talking about it the other day, is that in the wake of that 1892 fight, you go to, for instance, like when you asked, like, oh, what are some of like the first like marathon cards or stacked cards or whatever. And so you go back to Madison Square Garden in the 1880s when it popped up and started hosting fight cards. And so there were a handful of canceled cards right around that time. One of them was John L. Sullivan because he showed up too fucking drunk, for instance, but which is great in and of itself.
Was that Charlie Mitchell?
Yeah. Imagine that, dude. Imagine like Alexander
Then
Usyk,
Sullivan,
yeah,
Sullivan just
or
had
Tyson Fury or somebody shows up and they're just tanked, dude. And they're like, you guys, we hate to do this, but this fool's fallen down drunk. He can't fight. Like, can you imagine?
I
I'd
find
laugh.
Sullivan to be such a hilarious and fascinating character. Like I love reading more and finding out more about him because like it's an interesting life, you know what I mean? It's a very interesting life about one of the most interesting time periods, in my opinion, about boxing because of how everything evolved during that time. But like, yeah, his late career, like when he was really just, not the strong Sullivan first coming on the scene, and now this be time just becoming a stumbling, idiotic drunk, don't know where you're gonna find or what's gonna happen, if he's gonna end up in the hospital near death, or if he's gonna make a miraculous comeback or whatever's gonna happen. Like, what a era to be in. You know what I mean? Reading up in that newspaper and every day on the front page there was a new story about Sullivan getting into some kind of shit.
Yeah, dude, he got extremely out of shape. Even as champion, dude, you see like all the photos have him with like a big ass sash up to like his chest because it's covering up his gut, bro. And on top of that, he was like supposedly a dick to the point where it literally changed the heavyweight championship picture because he pissed off Richard K. Fox, who then went on a fucking crusade to find somebody to kick his ass. You know what I mean? Like, wow. All right. But in the wake of that fight in 1892, you go to Madison Square Garden and you look. And so, for instance, one way to do this for anybody going, like, how do you go to Madison Square Garden? Go to BoxRec, purchase a BoxRec Plus, Gray Johnson. But then go to the fucking, if you go to, there are a couple different ways to do it. But if you go to like the schedule, for instance, you can look fights up by location or by venue, and you go to Madison Square Garden, and it'll bring up literally 1,500 events, 77 pages. Go to page 77, starting from the beginning, and you can look event by event, all of these things. And you start to see that almost all of these fight cards are like one-offs in the 1880s and early 1890s. Like they're, featuring one particular fighter or one particular fight or whatever. And then all of a sudden, after 1892, they start hosting these like multi-fight cards. You go to the uppermost fight card on there, for instance, has Torpedo Billy Murphy, Johnny Gorman, a number of these fighters who like, or Patty Gorman, Billy McCarthy, who were not like massive name fighters, but had a number of fights and were like, experienced fighters and fighters that might have been recognized. And especially considering it's the 1890s, having like dozens or more of fights is a lot. So that being said, all of a sudden you start seeing the kind of field opening up as far as stacking the fight cards, or at the very least putting more fights on these cards. And I think that you start to see that promoters are recognizing that, oh shit, can make some money off this. You know what I mean?
1,000%. And so we get to this card right here. These were the three biggest. Well, I mean, you said Corbett was considered the top contender and a popular name, but Sullivan was the main guy in the top of the world. George Dixon was considered at that point, even though he was black, everyone kind of universally respected him for his skill and ability. I mean, he was the best fighter on the planet at that point, pound for pound. If you really want to go through it, definitely loads better than Sullivan and just ahead of Corbett and probably others at that point too. I mean, he started slipping soon after that, and others would emerge sooner or later after that too. That would eventually overtake him, like Terry McGovern, and then you guys soon after that, after McGovern, we've talked about too, like Barbados Joe Walcott and others would come around, but like at that point, George Dixon was the gold standard of it all. And McCuffley, who doesn't get talked about enough, I guess, in general, because his career obviously spanned way over 100 years ago. But I mean, wonderful champion as well. Should he have retired undefeated? I mean, that goes into question because there was a fight he had with the brilliant young Griffo, who we've talked about on the show before, that by all accounts in their fight, which happened in Coney Island in the late 1800s, and Griffo, brilliant practitioner, boxed rings around him, just circles, did whatever he wanted, and McCuffley came out with a bullshit decision. That was one of those fights that everyone, all the newspapermen and everyone were talking about back then, as one of the early controversies of just like what the fucks that soon would become a reoccurring thing in boxing. But that was before then. He was still in his prime at this point. And the interesting thing about this card is, like I said, they spread it out over 3 days. I guess to give each fight its proper attention, right?
I mean, I think that at that point it wouldn't have been, yeah, to also maximize the profit, I think, from their eyes, you know what I mean, or from their perspective. And if it's almost kind of like how boxing tied into the World's Fair when the World's Fair started, and they started trying to, for years, I mean, I think they still do the World Fair. Actually, it's just that it's not covered, but they for a number of years, and I think for a few decades, actually used to also tie in fight cards to the World's Fair in Chicago, and they similarly, I think, did that kind of thing here in New Orleans, which also used to be a massive fight town around this time, which sounds kind of weird, I guess. But, it was also a much more popular place, like a much more popular city overall in terms of like a burgeoning or growing city. And so, that's where there were like the Olympic Club and blah, blah, blah. So, anyway, yeah, I would imagine that it had a lot to do with maximizing the profit and trying to make sure that, people got their money's worth for this festival or whatever.
Totally. And I mean, it worked out well. I mean, obviously the main focus was Sullivan Corbett, but the other fights too got, the attention they deserved. McCuffley came out with his win. Dixon scored a knockout over, I think Skelly was making his pro debut, from what I've read. I have no idea, but wouldn't, at that time period, it wouldn't surprise me. But he ended up winning. And then the big one was when Corbett that in the next day when Corbett ends up boxing rings around a obviously fat, slow, washed Sullivan who was feebly charging at him and plodding and waddling around before he eventually got knocked down. It was a bloody heap. And by all accounts, again, had a dramatic scene where the whole place, came in utter silence, and which I could understood. Like we just said, Sullivan was a huge, huge, you know, like hero to all of America. He's probably one that, and when you think about it, he's probably the first sporting hero in the country, no?
I would imagine, yeah, at
Yeah.
least probably like a national sporting hero because there were definitely like big baseball stars, but like not everybody liked baseball and everybody could relate to baseball, you know?
And watching someone up close just bludgeon someone in the face is pretty awesome. So,
It's pretty fucking universal, you know what I'm saying?
so, so anyways, watching him, get dropped and the place going absolutely silent, and then Sullivan getting up and then making a speech saying, "Guys, I'm still your champion. I'll go be okay." And I just got beat by the better man tonight. Blah 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 blah. And that ushered in the new era of boxing. So yeah, want to talk about super cards? That's the first one that should be brought up too, because well, think about it. That's the one that kind of ushered in and started moving along everything.
Yeah, dude, there's no question that you have to give homage, where it needs to go in this case. And for a lot of the icky and bad things, not to even downplay them either, the straight up racist things that John L.
Mm.
Sullivan and James Corbett said and did, dude, they don't get passes for that whatsoever for me. But that also doesn't detract from their popularity and their influence over the sport.
Oh, 1,000%. Once Sullivan went out and Corbett, who, like we said, was a complete opposite of everything Sullivan was. And remember that episode we did a couple of years back on like Pretty Boys? I think in
Yeah.
reference to Ryan Garcia. Corbett, I guess, whether you want to look at it or way at not, was one of the original Pretty Boys. You know what I mean? With his little pompadour hair and wearing his suits and all the things he would do and having the cane and, appearing on theater like Sullivan did, but looking actually much more elegant and, you know, actually just looking smooth instead of the drunken, stumblings of Sullivan and doing whatever the fuck he was doing on there. Corbett was like an absolute dreamboat to those, people back then. Got their bloomers all in a fancy. But oh, especially too when he'd be wearing the butt cheek shorts when he'd be fighting, right?
Yeah,
So
because he had the high styled pompadour
sure.
hairdo, which was, and then he always, was walking around in a suit and had a cane and a fucking top hat, etc.
Hmm.
And I mean, he wasn't like a bad looking guy by any means, but especially as
He
far as
was just
fighters
he was
go.
just a completely like different, complete opposite from Sullivan. But he won over the crowd with it too. He was a popular guy. It wasn't everyone who was just like, oh man, he's too much of a pretty boy. He's not Sullivan. I mean, he thrashed Sullivan. Whether you liked it or not, like that was the man now. And I think he was universally respected and understood as that until he was eventually knocked off. But everyone still loved Sullivan. Like, I mean, he was still like if you go, and the last thing we can say about him, when you go in like years later, when film was getting much more advanced and stuff like that, and you would see him around making appearances at fights because he was an active guy. He was active, and making appearances for lectures and always being at fight shows. And that's one thing about boxing that they need to bring back is that even way back over 100 years ago, they would always have all the former world champions for a big ass fight. They would all be ringside for there, and they would get their newspaper predictions in while they would be sitting there. Like for one random example, Peddler Palmer against Terry McGovern went for the bantamweight title, which was in what 1899, 1900.
Sounds about right, yeah.
I think they had ringside there. Corbett was there. Sullivan was there. A few other former champions, like whoever was just, the guys, and they got all their opinions on who they was going to win that fight. So, I mean, that's when you start seeing Sullivan too. Old, everything like that. But I mean, he was still making appearances. So,
Showing up to the training camp of Jack Johnson and James Jeffries acting like he's never seen a fucking speed bag before.
those are
You,
like the massive ones too that just look like an actual heavy bag that you would
he's
hit it.
like,
Whoosh. Yeah,
he doesn't even know how to hit it, and it's just like, Jesus Christ. Yeah, I mean, no, that a couple of points. Yeah, they do need to bring that shit back, and I mean, they do sometimes for some cards and in some funny ways in some other countries, but overall, they do seem to not pay respect to former champions the way that they used to. And shit, we're talking about the late 1800s here. I mean, damn, come on now, get with the fucking times, y'all. But yeah, you also got to see holdovers from that era and how popular they were. There's absolutely no question that John L. Sullivan's influence was massive, dude. Fucking huge.
huge, totally.
Yeah, I mean, I think that overall, that's a fucking great example, and especially as far as a starting off point to figuring out exactly, where all the whole stacked cards and multi-fight card thing kind of started. And then I think that one of the first cards, just to kind of get it out of the way here, because why not? One of the first cards people are going to think of, and one of the first cards I know you're going to think of too, when people say, "What's one of the stacked cards from history?" Whenever they're going to say rematches, bro. The re, you
course.
know, and this is also where it kind of gets into a little bit of some asterisks and nuance for the whole stacked card business, because it's not just about, like I was saying earlier, matching perfect fights or matching great fights, and that sometimes there are some fights on there that are just throwing names on there, and conversely, sometimes fights are well matched and do have the greatest of intentions. They just don't pan out, dude. They're just not what they were supposed to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Revenge of the Rematches, first off, was promoted by Don King, and everyone that watches this show clearly knows that. But Don, for different reasons, I guess, over the years, has been either looked upon as either the greatest promoter of all time and looked upon now as everyone goes back into example, goes, look at the Don King cards of the 90s. That's what boxing needs to be. We need the Don King cards.
It's
And
almost like a stereotype now, yeah.
yeah, they always use him as the prime example. Look at those stack cards because they're always just thinking back on like
Like
I
all
get
he
it.
ever did was stacked cards.
Yeah, and I get it too. Like I have the nostalgia of watching pay-per-views back then, like you do, and seeing those cards and being excited for them, sure. But it's almost like you get trapped in a bubble thinking that's all he did, and then you have actual people who watch, listen to the show, and us who will be like, well, yeah, Don did those cards, but he also did a lot of just absolute shit in between. Just go to any of his Showtime shows in the 90s and watch that fucking Drek, and you'll realize it. We've talked
And
about
and
it
he had a
before.
lot to make up for from the 70s and 80s, bro.
Oh my God. I mean, some of those shows too that he was putting on back then were just absolute trash bag ones. I mean, again, he knew when he had to stack a card, like Holmes Cooney, for instance. That card was stacked, all right, like from top to bottom. He put all of his heavyweights on there. Even Ernie Shavers, James Tellis was like buried on the bottom of it. Like that was a really good card. I want to say Trevor Barbic and Greg Page was on that one too when Page was undefeated. But anyways, um, he knew when he had to stack him and he knew when he can just like deliver absolute direct just because he had a television contract. That's what he did with Showtime. The main provider of them, that's he could give them whatever he wanted and they basically had to, watch and then they basically had to air it. But Revenge of the Rematches, that came about more or less because of, like we said, all these different fights that King had on different cards that ended up either being crazy upsets or bangers or vice versa, whatever it may be. So, what was it? Gerald McClellan and Julian Jackson, for example, their first fight was an absolute scorcher for, what was it, 5 rounds that it lasted. I mean, that was a can't miss fight to begin with because Jackson, one of the greatest punchers of all time, was just ravaging dudes. And then McClellan, when he came up again, in the mold of Tommy Hearns, but like except meaner and a little bit more like rougher around the edges. Like he didn't have the boxing pedigree of Hearns, but he was just like nastier than Hearns. You know what I mean? Like when you come in and when you knock you out and you would just beat the shit out of you afterwards and you'd be growling and then you see him in photos of his pit bulls and all this other stuff. He just gave off a scary demeanor. And their first fight was ridiculous. I mean, Jackson was hitting him with bombs that would have knocked anyone else out, and McClellan took them, but he was clearly being affected by it until he came back and just almost knocked Jackson's head off into the nosebleed section. So that definitely warranted a rematch. Um, Terry Norris and Simon Brown. That was the biggest upset of the year at that point too, because Brown was looked upon as being washed up, and Norris was on top 3 or 4 pound for pound, and Brown bounced him around like a pogo stick in their first fight. What was that in Mexico?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, but you remember in that first fight, like Brown drops him with a jab. I think it was.
Yeah, it was almost like he got like something with his equilibrium off or something, because after that it was like he just couldn't even stay up.
Oh, it was absolutely ridiculous, man. I remember as a kid because I never Revenge of the Rematches was one of the first cards I watched fully with my dad. I begged him to go to my uncle's house to watch it. And when we went there and they were showing previews, they were showing, yeah. And at first he was like, no, no. My mom was just like, yo, just take him, like, whatever. And so he did. But, anyways, I remember watching the preview of Norris Brown and seeing the way Norris was getting knocked around in that first fight. I was just like, yo, he looks like a WWF wrestler. Like, the way he was getting, like, bounced. I mean, it was exaggerated looking, but like you said, man, like, he was cooked. So that warranted a rematch. Um, what was the other ones after that? I mean, obviously Chavez Randall, and then was there one more? Oh, Nelson Leja, right?
Yeah,
Azumah Nelson, Jesse James Leja.
bro. Now I gotta know. Now I gotta look at this shit. Is Simon Brown in the hall? I think we talked about this on the
Oh
fucking.
no, he's not even on the ballot.
Shit.
Not even on the ballot.
Fuck out of my face.
Yeah,
Eh,
but
Yeah, I just had to know. Anyway, 'cause I want to say I thought we mentioned that the other day, but whatever. That being said, yeah, dude, I think that this is also that fight card is kind of like the quintessential. A lot of people are going to go immediately to that card, and I mean, rightly so, dude. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the card. Like like I said, I think this is one of those cards where they had the best intentions, and it wasn't an awful card either. But it was just that they had the best intentions, and they tried to make the best of a situation that was unexpected, especially for King. You know what I'm saying? Because he had a handful of these stars here. Ricardo Lopez was. It sucks that most of his career was basically spent on the fourth, fifth, or sixth fight on these fucking big cards, on a lot of these Don King cards, because he deserved far more focus than that. But I mean, they had the best of intentions with this going in with a lot of these fights, and like you mentioned, for the reasons you mentioned, they were matched correctly. These fights should have happened. The rematches were there. Julio César Chávez losing to Frankie Randall. I mean, that was probably like the ickiest result on the card there, where with the technical decision ending and shit like that. Yeah, you know what I mean? That was probably the icky fucking cherry on top that really made it feel not good. But yeah, I don't think there was really anything wrong with the card per se. Just one of those flops that wasn't what we'd hoped.
that's what I always say about it. Like on paper, it looks like the best, one of the best cards in history. And I get it, in terms of pay-per-view, it still stands on paper as one of the best ones out there ever. Totally.
Yeah,
But
there's nothing wrong with it.
sometimes that doesn't mean it's going to translate that on television. And somehow this card just didn't do that. Leija Nelson in their rematch, because their first fight was a controversial draw that most people thought that Leija should have won. And in their rematch, Nelson, who could go through lapses of just kind of looking like he was disinterested in the fight and looking like he's washed, had one of those nights. And this was like his first time that he lost a rematch where he just looked listless and he got dropped. I think he got dropped early on and just lost a relatively wide decision. Um, Jackson and Gerald McClellan, same thing. I mean, that was a blowout. No one expected it to be a blowout, but Jackson got absolutely obliterated. I mean, he looked like an early Mike Tyson victim. Hence why they started calling Gerald McClellan baby Mike Tyson. And when they told Nigel Benn soon after that, we're gonna sick baby Mike Tyson on you, because McClellan was just doing that to guys back then. And unfortunately, to his detriment, he fell in love with his power because of what he was doing to guys like Jackson. And then Simon Brown and Terry Norris, unfortunately, that was like a fight that no one would ever want to watch again because it was an absolute waltz. Brown did at nothing, fall Norris around like a zombie, and Norris, because he knew he couldn't stand around with Brown and try to get fucked up again, just boxed his way to a clear cut decision, doing what he had to do. And Chavez Randall, well, speaks for itself again too. Like you just said, it was a fight that Randall appeared like he was on his way to win again. He was getting the better. I mean, it was close, but Randall was getting the better of it. And as that was gaining traction, because Chavez was like withering, and then the headbutt happened. A stupid ass rule where they deduct a point from you. The WBC one. Do they still have that rule, or is that like
I think they do, dude.
really? Hmm. I mean, I wouldn't even know. I haven't paid attention so long.
If they, yeah, I don't even really care whether they do or don't at this point, but I think they do. But I mean, not it's still a dumb organization whether they do or not.
I mean, it's like such a dumbass thing too, especially with an accidental headbutt. It's not like the guy went in there sometimes and like blatantly,
Yeah, it's the
pulled a Hopkins
dumbest.
or nothing.
There's no reason for it. It's stupid. Just
But
a
we all knew
boxing
too
shoe
that
gets
when
into the
that
foot.
absolutely, and we all know too that like Chavez was the WBC's favorite son, and in their first fight, Chavez lost 2 points for low blows. I think it was. Was it a point or 2 points? I think it was around like 2 points or so, and he got dropped.
because that was the whole, like they were mad at the fucking refereeing and it
Oh
was
yeah,
like,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Chavez was having a temper tantrum about Richard Steele, and then his interpreter was going even crazier. I've never seen an interpreter get that pissed off before.
Yeah,
She
that
was
yeah,
so
that lady was about to fight for somebody, dude. She was
Oh,
about to
her
shank
face was
somebody.
beat red. She was pissed that Chavez lost because that wasn't supposed to happen. Not King Chavez, but I was gonna say this that like look at those scorecards. He had 2 points deducted and he got dropped in that fight, and the referee still was just and he won by 1 point, I think 1 or 2 points by on the Mexican judge's scorecard. Won by like and Randall won by like a point or two on the other two, like a point, which means he would have lost that fight if it wasn't for the knockdown. If it
Yeah, they
wasn't
were trying really
yeah,
hard to
like he
not
had
give
to
that
do
shit to
everything
Frankie.
to make absolutely. And that's why they were like, yeah, Richard Steele was in cahoots with him because how dare I lose that fight? So they would do everything in their way to make sure Chavez got back and they were gonna save his ass this time.
Well,
Which they
they wanted him to get to 100 no so badly. Like they were gunning for 100 no.
oh sure,
They
sure.
just couldn't like protect him to 100 no. And I guess you got to give Chavez some credit too. He wasn't really down to like be protected to 100 no. He was going to fight. But it was just that sometimes gosh, dude, he could be a real fucking baby.
And that really shone after that. I mean, like there were signs of it. Um, there were signs of it after the Whitaker fight. First off, when Whitaker clearly beat him and it was a draw, and Chavez was like, "Yeah, all he did was run and
Yeah, he didn't stand
and
and fight. And it's like
yeah, he didn't stand and fight, and I won't
actually he
respect
totally
you."
did and he beat your ass a number of times, but
Yeah, Whitaker fucked him up in that fight. Like that wasn't that close at all.
yeah, there were some rounds where he did stand and fight, and he totally tore his ass up. Like it wasn't even fucking
One of my
close.
favorite performances of all time because like, everything was stacked against Whitaker that
Yeah,
night.
they ripped his ass off so bad, dude.
And that's an interesting card to talk about too, because think of it this way, that was also on pay-per-view, but Whitaker was an HBO guy. And that's another dynamic is that back in the 90s, so this was a Showtime card that Revenge of the Rematches was on, right? And so, Showtime and HBO were in direct competition with each other, but back in the 90s, HBO clearly was like a step ahead. At least that's how everybody kind of viewed it. Like if you want to look at it in wrestling terms, um, the HBO would be WWE and WCW is Showtime, right? Especially
Yeah,
before the
that's
NWO
pretty.
and all that.
Yeah,
If that's how you want to look at it. I mean, both had really good, fighters and everything like that, but
I'd say it's
clearly,
pretty accurate. Yeah,
sure. And but the pay-per-view, so like what so a guy there was like designated fighters for each network back then, clearly, right? And Whitaker was always known as an HBO guy. He had never appeared on anywhere else. I mean, he'd been on like network television a couple of times after the Olympics, but he has always been an HBO guy since around 1990 or so. And now it's what
well, a
was it,
lot of the main events guys were. Yeah,
Totally, totally. Showtime. I mean, Evander Holyfield was on Showtime up until when he knocked out Buster Douglas, but after that, he became an HBO guy through and through until he eventually joined Don King back on Showtime. But yes, all the main events guys, Lou Duver and them were a staple on HBO. You weren't seeing most of them on Showtime. So it was a big deal when Whitaker moved to Showtime to fight Chavez because that was one of those times that like HBO wasn't going to be happy about that. He was one of their star fighters. No one was really kind of like, what the fuck? And not only did he do that too, he went to San Antonio to fight him in Chavez's backyard. And yeah, that was a Showtime event, Showtime produced. HBO had no involvement in that, and that was a Showtime pay-per-view.
which is funny too because I was saying earlier that if you look at a lot of these cards that we're going to bring up, the vast majority of them that were stacked for better or worse is like a single promoter or like one promoter offering up the majority of the big fighters or whatever. Most of them are not collaborations. Most of them are not split pay-per-views or where the fuck Chris Mannix likes to call those stupid ass things. The shit just like it, that shit does not happen like that very often whatsoever. And the vast majority of the times that it has happened where promoters have come together to make a bigger fight or whatever, the card has not been stacked. That's just not how it fucking goes. But so that is kind of interesting that there would be like kind of an allegiance shift or whatever. But that happened a couple times with a handful of fighters in the 80s and 90s with HBO and Showtime, probably most notably Mike Tyson. And usually it involved Don King, with Don King throwing some sort of fucking fit.
1,000%. And it wasn't a bad card too on paper if you look at it. It wasn't like absolutely stacked, but I mean it had names on it. It was the first Azumah Nelson, Jesse James Leija fight. Terry Norris absolutely obliterated Joe Arturo Gotti's older brother Joe. Like nasty knockout if you ever seen it. It's
Yeah,
pretty.
dude. He caught a couple of them.
Yeah, man, poor Joe Gotti. He wasn't a bad fighter at all. Not as popular as Arturo, but I mean, he was a good fighter. But like, apparently before the fight, he talked a lot of shit to Norris and was running his mouth. And Norris was not the type of guy who was perpetually always mad. Was not the type of guy you want to piss off. And so Norris took his anger out. And if you watch it, Gotti gets hit with a shot and just grabs his face, and because I think he got his nose broken, it's nasty. But yeah, Whitaker Chavez ends up happening over there. And like I said, he goes to San Antonio, Chavez's backyard. And the biased ass announcers, Steve Albert wasn't really biased. I mean, he called it pretty straight down the line, but Ferdy Pacheco was biased as shit towards Chavez. And wherever Ferdy went, Bobby Chez usually would tend to follow as well when I go on the commentary team. Because if you would always listen to them, you would always hear Ferdy refer to Bobby. Oh, Bobby, you say, what do you think about that? Ah, Bobby, and, yeah, Ferdy, and like, those two are always just each other's best friend. So early on, you're watching that fight and you just hear a lot of stuff because he like Ferdy was such a Chavez guy, and I get it. Chavez is their guy and whatever it may be, but like I don't know if he just didn't respect Whitaker because he thought he was a runner or something. But like those first few rounds, you're listening to him. He's calling him Pee Wee over and over instead of Sweet Pea, and he see you shaking your head because you already know, right? He was just being an idiot,
Yeah,
and
it's fucking dumb. Yeah, he chose an early fight narrative on that one and was just going with it.
you could tell he was getting almost annoyed that he had to like switch it up later on when it was clear that Whitaker was getting the better of him, and yeah,
It was like George Foreman during Hopkins Trinidad, except for George never switched. Even up until the knockout, George was like, "Oh no, he's dangerous," and it's like George, he's getting fucking whooped, bro. What are you talking about? Except for yeah, he had to
didn't Larry
begrudging
even
him.
call him out on that at one point? Larry
Yeah,
did call him out. He was like, George, why don't you give Hopkins respect or something? Right? He said something to
a
that.
couple of times he
Yeah.
said something, and like during one of the rounds, he was George was saying something like, "I don't understand why blah blah blah." Like I think he said something like, "I don't understand why Trinidad's not throwing this," or "I don't understand why Trinidad's blah blah blah." And Larry just goes, "That's because Bernard Hopkins is a great fighter, and he's not letting him do it, George." Like it's like, is he the only one watching what's happening during this fight? It was
Sure.
anyway, but yeah, similarly, it was a lot of anti Pernell Whitaker bias. That's the funny thing though, too, is just to not get fully off track here, but Pernell Whitaker is thankfully very fondly remembered now and popular. Thank goodness and rest in peace. But at the time, he was not, dude. There was a very big split. A lot of people acknowledged that he was very good, but just did not like him.
Oh, 1,000%. My dad wasn't a fan of watching him. He would always moan and groan whenever a Whitaker fight would come
Yeah,
on.
I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't like his biggest fan. I didn't dislike him either, but I wasn't like his biggest fan.
As a kid, I wasn't like, when he would come on, I wasn't like, oh my God, not Whitaker. But like, I almost just got the sense until he fought Oscar that I'm like, he's not going to be really tested. Well, until he fought Hurtado. And then, Hurtado dropped him. And I remember like losing my mind on that because I thought an upset was in the making. But I mean,
Yeah,
until
stoppage was
like,
nuts.
yeah. But other Whitaker early fights, when I was, getting into the sport, aside from, I guess, the first Wilfredo Rivera fight, and even then, I thought Whitaker won. I just kind of went in with the impression that he was just gonna do what he did. You know what I mean? Just go in there and box the guy, and he probably wasn't gonna knock him out, but I was still watching the master at his craft. So I kind of like appreciated for that, but I knew going inside that I probably wasn't gonna be getting some dramatic shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you generally were not. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, you'd get a show, just not a show like that. But some people don't like that kind of show. Whatever.
But as you've said too, we've all grown to appreciate him over the years as we get older and watch him now and go back and watch him. Like, oh, he wasn't a runner. He like really stood in there and just like beat the shit out of dudes' bodies and would jab you and stay in the pocket. He just made it look that easy. It was just a brilliant, brilliant guy. Rest in peace, like you said. So,
Yeah.
oh,
Well, yeah, I was just gonna say, indeed. And so, I mean, that's I guess my offering. It's obviously skipping forward like almost 100 or more than 100 years, but but hey,
but
dude, it's a big gap.
sure. But Don King. also too is that like you think of the big name cards that he had, oh, the Tyson ones and stuff like that. But Don, a lot of the time as well, would also because he just needed to keep his guys busy because he had to have like a minimum on his contracts. He would also make like Chavez. Chavez, well, a lot of the times, sometimes they wouldn't just be on Showtime. They would have also pay-per-view fights. The first Randall fight, for example, was on pay-per-view. Um, and usually a fight like of that magnitude, Randall was the number one contender and a long time contender and a top guy, but not a guy that I guess warranted pay-per-view at that point. But also King had what was it, Hector Camacho, Trinidad on the undercard of it, and Tommy Hearns, I think, opened it as well. So, in terms of names and looking at the Hall of Famers on that whole card up and down, that's pretty impressive. You know what I mean? You go back again to like these are the ones that people look back on fondly, or like the first two Tyson Ruddock fights, right? The first one featured, I want to say, the first one featured Maurice Blocker and Simon Brown, right?
Yep.
And this is what I say about guys talking about, oh, we're best friends, we'll never fight because they're best friends. Simon Brown and Maurice Blocker were co-welterweight champions at that point. Um, Blocker best friends as well. You know what I mean? Like outside of the ring, I think they like lived in the same area in Maryland, right? DC, Maryland area.
Hmm.
And so best friends, the family knew each other, wives loved each other. Everyone, just really got along. But the fight came up that they realized, you know what, we got to put our friendship aside. We got to go in there. We're going to fight. And it was a vicious, vicious fight. That fight kicked ass. If you've never seen it, go back and watch it. It was a brilliant fight. But Blocker, even though he was a very good boxer and tall and lanky, he was never the most durable guy if you can get to him. And yeah, like when he got knocked out, he would get knocked.
Yeah. That fool got just fell like in sections, just like every single one
And
of
he was
his
such a
fucking
tall and lanky guy,
yeah.
man. And he just,
Poor
oh, he
guy.
fought so badly. But yeah, Simon Brown eventually broke through and, stopped him. But after that fight, they went out together for dinner after. So him and their wives, and they met up and acted like nothing had happened. But there was that one, and then the rematch for Tyson Ruddock was Azumah Nelson and Jeff Fennick in their first
Yep.
fight.
Yeah, and the other fights that were on the first Tyson Ruddock card were like, unfortunately they were like, but again, this goes to what we were talking about. Julio César Chavez versus John Duplessis, Roberto Duran versus Pat Lawler, Greg Page, Mark Young, Bernard Hopkins versus a guy named Steve Langley, Justin Juco making his pro debut. So again, like there's names, but these are not like high level or well matched fights at all.
Totally. And that was the thing about King's pay-per-views, if you really want to go to the depth of it too, man. Like everyone's like, oh, look back, that's rose-tinted glasses because the majority of them were really not that good. And that's when you talk about stacked cards. Like, yeah, he had names on them, but they weren't good. They weren't
Yeah, there's a
like,
lot of nostalgia.
yeah, it's just they weren't like good ones. Look at Tyson Holyfield 2, for example, is one of the worst cards I've ever seen in terms of a major pay-per-view. That card fucking sucked. I'm not looking at BoxRec right now. I have it up, but I'm not bringing up the card. But I remember Miguel Angel Gonzalez against Roberto Graciosa, something like that. Because these were showcase fights because Miguel Angel and Chavez were getting ready to fight each other. Chavez was in a fight against Larry Lacosiere. If you saw him, man, that dude looked nothing like a fighter, and I guess he was a triathlon or like a marathon runner or something, and he ran a marathon that night against Chavez to go the distance in a very boring fight. Late 90s Chavez was not fun to watch.
He had that kind of like what was that guy on fucking Punch Out? Fucking Don Flamenco look to him where
Yeah.
he's like balding and he kind of just looked like lanky and gangly and like did not
Mhm.
really look like a fighter. Looked like he was did something like an English teacher or something like that.
Yeah,
I mean, I remember him getting fucking knocked out by Camacho Jr. a few years later. It was yeah, poor guy. He was definitely an opponent
absolutely. Who am I missing? Who else was on that one? Was
Uh,
Terry Norris on that?
on the rematch.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I'd have to look. I don't remember.
Was it Terry Norris against like Alex Rios or something?
So it was Riddick Bowe versus Rodolfo Martin or
Oh
Marin.
no, 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 I meant Tyson Holyfield too.
Oh God, yeah, no, that was not good.
Yeah, that's what I was just talking about that card. Yeah.
Yeah,
So that
fucking
was Miguel Angel
Harry.
Gonzalez, Chavez, and was it Alex Rios against Terry Norris, or am I?
Um, no, there was Lonnie Bradley, John Williams,
Oh God, I remember that fight.
Christy Martin versus Andrea Deschong,
Okay,
Roberto Garcia when he was and against Angel Aldama, Nate Jones, Willie Chapman, Billy Wright, Martin Lopez. Yeah,
Tyson Holyfield too.
yeah,
Oh, hold on. That was the hold on. That was the no, that was hold on. What was it? The event? Oh yeah, yeah. Lonnie Bradley, yeah. Oh God. So
yeah.
Jesus, man, that was the pay-per-view. That was
He
Chavez.
wasn't even throwing names on there because at least on the
Oh
for the
God, yeah,
first
no,
fight,
no, no. I thought you were missing something, but I had to go double check that myself.
no.
I'm like, oh God,
Not because if you
the
look at
worst ever
for
event.
the first fight, it actually looks like, like there's some shit on there. Like, well, but again, that was the funny thing was for the first fight, that was part of the draw was that like first of all, it's Tyson Holyfield, which was like everybody had waited for forever. But then a lot of people forget that the other like, promotional aspect of the first fight was that it was a fucking fight card with three heavyweight title fights on it because Henry Akinwande held the WBO title at that time. He
Behind
fought
me over there. The poster's hanging up.
yeah, Alexander Zolkin versus Henry Akinwande for the WBO title, and then Michael Moore versus Franz Botha versus for the IBF title, and Tyson Holyfield for the WBA. Meanwhile, fucking, they're messing around with the WBC with Lennox Lewis and McCall not too long before that. And in any case, yeah, that was at least that like there was like a some semblance of a draw or whatever. You got Ricardo Lopez on there too, Christy Martin again, but not good. Not good at the rematch.
And so that I think that if you'll agree with me, I think that was a reoccurring theme in the 90s was that both King, Aram, and others for that matter realized that everyone, hey, they're just coming for the main event. Why am I going to stack my card up? Like, yeah, we'll put title fights on the undercard, or we'll just have like a name or two, but we don't need to actually stack this card. We'll do it with attractions, but like, I don't need to like actually stack it with like really major competitive fights that are just going to put me out of more
Yeah.
pocket than I need to when everyone's just going to come to see Tyson or they're going to come to see De La Hoya or they're going to, whoever it's supposed to be. And so that's why there was a major drop off in quality, especially in the mid to late 90s, where Bob Arum was stacking his cards with Butterbean and Mia St. John on almost every single undercard slot, and then putting in, like a showcase title defense for like Vasily Girov or someone before, you would have, I don't know, like say like De La Hoya Trinidad, or say De La Hoya Corte, for example. I think like Arab Morales had like a showcase title fight on the undercard, and there might have been like a couple other guys, but like again, they weren't just like fights that they're going to be like, oh man, these are major competitive fights. These are just names
Yeah.
just keep active.
And that's just the reality of, and I'm not even like a business of boxing person. I don't really like that shit. I don't really follow it. I don't really care to understand it. However, I understand enough to get around. And I think that the reality of it is that this is where kind of like boxing promoters and people who are paying attention to the business aspect of it, that's where they diverge from fans and where fans just can't with their pea brains fucking get it because they think in their head and in our head because we're also fans we think what the fuck, you know what I'm saying, like why don't we get what we want because we're the fans, we're the ones paying for it. We want high level competitive fights. We want this and this and this fight and all this type of shit. Why don't they do that for us? You know what I'm saying, like we're the ones calling the shots, we're the ones buying the product. Why the fuck aren't they doing this? The reality is they don't have to and you'll still buy it. That's the fucking thing. They instead of take any of these cards we've already spoken about, and it's basically like what you had just said. Don King at some point realized, probably in the early 2000s, because he was still doing it into the 2000s. Aram and Top Rank kind of stopped, but or at least they kind of tapered it down. King was still doing it into the 2000s, but started to realize that like these cards where I have all of these title fights, rather than having them in this one big card that might do okay, I'm just going to split them up and do these separate little 4 or 5 cards that will do a little bit better. And so therefore I'll just get more money. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't make sense. And on top of that, if you have some sort of network deal, it's a way to easily appease the network with all of these other fights. And you can just slap whatever the fuck you want on the undercard. And so business wise, it just doesn't make sense to stack the cards and give fans all these fucking great fights. It only makes sense if you just have gobs of money that you don't really care about.
Couldn't have said it better than myself. Um, so here's hold on, I'm trying to bring it up right now. Who goes to the event? Da-da-da. All right, cool. Um, Talking about stacked cards though, and like ones that, we talk about the drop off of stacked cards and how they were in the 90s and all that other shit. But let's go back to the 1930s really quick because this is a card that was not dropped off in quality. And in fact, if it happened today, would be commanding a super duper high price for, on pay-per-view or whatever it may be, and one of those cards that everyone would be salivating over. And we're talking about another Parade of Champions one. So this is 1937, and we're going with Lou Ambers, Pedro Montanez. This happened at the Polo Grounds in New York. Lou Ambers, Pedro Montanez for the lightweight championship. Barney Ross, Seferino Garcia for the welterweight title. Marcel Till, who scary looking individual, against Fred Apostoli for the middleweight championship, and Sixto Escobar against Harry Jeffra for the bantamweight title. That's like crazy.
Yeah, that's like an actual legitimate fucking, like
Yeah.
that's like you're actually putting together actual high level fucking matchups for people there.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess you're bringing back fights at the Polo Grounds, which especially in the 1920s is kind of like the heyday of when they started putting fights on at the Polo Grounds, like one of the more famous ones, Jack Dempsey versus Luis Angel Firpo, for instance. And that was a part of the kind of storied history of this venue. And so it makes sense that you would put these 4 stars, these guys who all together, Pedro Montana is probably not quite as much, but these other 4 fighters were legitimately stars, or maybe just a notch below that for some of them. Those are big fights.
Huge for that time. And I mean, these were all actually really big competitive fights, top to bottom, like really, really good ones. I mean, Montanez was an absolute phenomenon for Puerto Rico back then. I mean, this was a guy that had beaten Ambers in a non-title fight before then, had slashed through most of the competition at lightweight at that point, and just a generally like a great fighter. One of those fighters who looked upon back now as one of the best who never won a world title. Doesn't get talked about enough today because
Yeah. A great
rarely.
example of just how deep that fucking division and that time was at lightweight and welterweight.
Oh, mhm.
Sickening.
It's insane. And I mean, like, he never ever gets talked about today. I learned about him when I was a kid by like just reading a couple of articles about him. And then when he passed away, Mario Rivera Martino, obviously one of the greatest fight writers from the island of Puerto Rico, and a guy who lived a long ass life. Like, he was just very active up from the 30s up until, his death in the 2000s. But he wrote, extensive articles about him and talked about his greatness, and that got me intrigued about him. And just a fascinating guy. Montanez was a very good fighter, really good looking guy too. Like, he would have been hugely popular today. But anyways, him and Ambers was a very big fight. Barney Ross and Seferino Garcia. I mean, we've talked about Ross before, one of the greatest fighters of all time, and Garcia was just an absolute brute of a human, a very dangerous fighter who had one punch knockout power and a big guy for the welterweight division. And even though he wasn't as clean and like a clear, boxer like Ross, he didn't need to be. Like, his size and his strength, almost like Margarito, made everyone else's skill just invaluable. Like, it didn't matter to them. Like, he would just bowl you over. And the next one, Marcel Till and Fred Apostoli. So this one gets interesting, right? Because it's for the middleweight championship, but we've talked about this before. The middleweight division was so muddled back then
It was a
that
mess in the 1930s.
when you think about that era, yeah, people today, when they complain about how muddled the division is and who's the true champion, yada yada yada, I get it. It's really confusing and annoying as shit, but like a lot of these have nothing compared to the absolute dreck and confusion of the 1930s middleweight division and trying to claim who was a champion. This shit lasted almost a decade.
Yeah, it's actually pretty wild too. And I mean, for good reason too. We talk about, for instance, and that's one of the funny things that I've brought up on numerous like history shows. I like to kind of make fun of people when they say things like, "Oh, the eight original divisions," where it's like, dude, there have been junior divisions for so long that there's such small windows for eight divisions. And then on top of that, like when people say things like, "Oh, this was the real championship or the true championship," in some cases it really was. In other cases, there was dispute or multiple claimants and all this type of shit. And this, like the middleweight division, is a great example of that. In the wake of Stanley Ketchel, for instance, dying when he got shot and killed in 1910, there was, like a massive list of fucking middleweights who claimed the middleweight championship until a guy named Frank Klaus a couple years later was able to basically consolidate that and restart the lineage. And then again, when Mickey Walker vacated the title and went to heavyweight in the 1930s, he was considered a fairly dominant heavy or a middleweight champion, at the very least, a popular middleweight champion. And then when he vacated the title, the list of fucking people claiming the title will go down it very quickly. Gorilla Jones, Marcel Phil, Ben Jebby, Lou Brouillard, Vince Dundee, Teddy Yaroz, Babe Briscoe, Freddie Steele, Fred Apostoli, Al Hostak, Sully Krieger, Seferino Garcia, Ken Overland, Tony Zale, Billy Seuss, until Tony Zale finally reconsolidated the NBA and the New York State Athletic Commission titles. And then shortly after then, those organizations started evolving into other organizations, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need to get into all that. But point is, as I just obviously pointed out, hopefully messy, super messy. And it took 10 years.
It's absolutely insane. It was such a weird era. And Till was not, I mean, he was a tough guy and a really like awkward fighter and kind of one of those early precursors to like, oh man, put a shirt back on because he looked like George the Animal Steel except
Marcel
smaller.
Phil. Yeah,
Yeah.
he was yeah, straight up, bro. He definitely had that fucking what's his
Bald
name?
head, hairy butt.
He had that Petey Saron fucking look
Yeah,
going, you know what I'm saying?
that's right. Yeah, man. And by all accounts, just an absolute bruiser in the ring. But about this point too, coming to this fight, he was known as a guy who was always getting by now on like DQ fights, on just bullshit things happening to him, either getting hit by low blows or this or that.
Yeah, the guy was like
He
the
fought a lot of
DQ
times.
king.
Yeah, I mean, it was crazy. You just look at his record and you just kind of like, what the fuck is going on back then? And there's not a lot of footage of him, so you can't really gauge of how good or bad he was. But it was one of those things that he fought a lot of most of the time in France. And so he was kind of like, in Europe and where he could be kind of protected. So coming over to America now to finally like get his comeuppance was was actually pretty good. So and then in the fourth one, you have Sixto Escobar, who was the Puerto Rico's first world champion at bantamweight. A wonderful fighter, an extremely popular guy too. I mean, especially in the New York area, because I mean, think about it, like Puerto Rico, boxing having their first champion over there, and a guy who was really he was a popular guy, like a very good, a great fighter, but also like um what's the word I'm thinking about? Sociable. You know what I mean? He was out there for the people and like everyone loved him. Like you see photos of him and he always has a wide smile on his face and just looks like a guy you want to hang around. And at that point too, he was the king of a what was a very deep bantamweight division. Panama Al Brown at that point had, since had been more or less off the scene. After that came the guy that beat Saint Chile, Baltazar Saint Chile from Spain, wasn't he? I think. But
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, he came and then he became champion. Then there was Tony Marino and a few others. But once Sixto Escobar became like undisputed champion, he beat all those dudes. Like he knocked out Marino, he knocked out Indian Quintana, and just solidified himself as being like the man of that division. And Jeffra, just a wonderful fighter who people have been championing to get into the Hall of Fame for a number of years. Absolutely outclassed him that night. So I mean, just top to bottom, it was just a wonderful card.
yeah. It's a extremely rare. I mean, I can't even really readily, even though we did some of the research for the show, I can't readily come up with any other instances where there was like, four high level fights like that on one card, like, to that degree. Doesn't really happen, and it's extremely rare. Um, I would guess that probably the closest that I could come, great example, by the way, but the closest that I could come to that would probably be, and it does not stack up, would be a card in 1920, and that would be Jack Dempsey's very first defense of the heavyweight championship against Billy Miskey, and it was their third fight, but also on the card. And again, it doesn't hold up because the matchups were not on that level. Were Sam Langford and Harry Greb in separate fights, obviously. And I mean, imagine going there to see the heavyweight championship of a guy who just won the championship, the previous year and rose to fame, shot to fame, really, and was extremely popular. You go to see his first title defense, and you get to see, I don't know, a significant knockout. The dude gets knocked, basically under the ropes, and you get to see Jack Dempsey in his heyday and whatnot. And then you get to also see two of the greatest fighters of all time, and Sam Langford and Harry Greb also on the same card. Tough to beat.
1,000%. That's a great one. I mean, think about it. Again, it doesn't have to be against guys that are like legends, but when you have names that are like all-time greats on a card, it works out in itself that ends up being like a stat card. And I mean, those are, well, I don't cons Dempsey's such a weird name. I know people have a lot of reverence. I mean, a lot of people that like really like live by the sword of him have since passed away because Dempsey's prime obviously was like 100 years ago. But there's always just been like this love affair with Dempsey. Same thing with Marciano and others, where he kind of gets put on a pedestal where maybe I don't even know if he should be up there the way he is. You know what I mean? Is Dempsey one of the greatest heavyweights ever? Yes, I guess in terms of like top 15-ish or so. Yeah, he's around there maybe, right? But I think it's just a phenomenon. Same thing with Sullivan and his popularity of him gets elevated more so than what it is because like guys like Langford and Greb are just, way levels above him. Hence why he never fought them. I mean, there was times that Dempsey was offered to fight Langford, and by that time Langford was nearly blind and just washed up and everything, and Dempsey by definitely would have won. But also at the same time, you don't want to take the risk of getting
Yeah,
like
but even
clocked.
then he didn't really want to. So
Exactly, because you just never knew, man. All Langford had to do was feel around the ropes and get a feel for where he was at, and there was a chance he might not
yeah,
pass out.
go feel around.
So you didn't want to take that risk. And then whenever him and Greb got together for sparring, Greb, apparently used to trounce him every single time and rather easily. So Dempsey wasn't trying to go that route either of fighting him. So I mean, it's hard to gauge it. But again, to see guys like Langford and Greb on the same card, fuck.
Unfortunately, dude, and it's not his fault. It's not Jack Dempsey's fault, but he does kind of, at least for me, seem to kind of get knocked down a notch because the hyperbole is like too much. You know what I mean? Like even Mike Tyson says shit like, "Oh, that's the most vicious fighter who ever lived." No, he fucking what? Come on, no, he wasn't, bro. He wasn't even the most vicious fighter of his time. Sam Langford was more vicious than he was. You know what I mean? Like it's not. I'm not trying to downplay him either. I'm not like not a fan of Jack Dempsey. It's just that the hyperbole is a lot. And you also see a lot of instances where uh on his record there were some fights where he clearly got outboxed and was said that he probably should have lost the decision, but got the decision instead. There were some fights where, I don't want to say he was dirty, but he like hitting behind the head or like holding and hitting and setting up for a knockout type of thing. Anyway, again, not to downplay him too hard, but I think we're on the same wavelength about Dempsey. Great fighter, but yeah, closer like top 15 ish, 18.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Listen, I just like Dempsey was a street guy though. At the thing, like a dude that used to ride the hobo
Super
train.
interesting. Love reading about him. But yeah.
Absolutely. And but like you said, the love that people have for him, if you were around that era, you absolutely were adoring him. I mean, look at, for instance, Ray Arcel. Ray Arcel is deemed one of the greatest trainers of all time, and rightfully so. I put him in Eddie Futch 1 and 2, right? Or 1A, 1B, whatever you want to do. Anyways, but Arcel came up as a fan too. Like when he was first, breaking bread into the boxing business and getting his feet wet and learning the business, Dempsey was like coming on the scene. Arcel was there. He said the first time he saw Dempsey was when Dempsey fought John Lester Johnson, which you just posted about recently. And John Lester Johnson, a talented black fighter from the era, but not looked upon as one of the top-notch black fighters of that time period. Like he wasn't looked upon the same level as Langford, Jeanette, or any of those guys, but a good fighter, a very
Hmm.
good fighter, nonetheless. And Arcel said that him and a few of his friends, because people were like, "Oh, you got to see this kid Dempsey. You got to see what blah blah blah." So Arcel and a few of his friends rode up to the I forgot what club it was, wherever in Harlem, to go watch it, and He said John Lester Johnson smacked him around for 10 rounds. He was like, it wasn't even competitive. And Arcel said after that, he was like, I saw absolutely nothing in him. And then a few years, a couple of years later or whatever it was, Dempsey fights Willard. And Arcel again is ringside there too. Apparently this guy was everywhere back then. And he said that
Yeah,
was the most
he's the one doing the fucking jig and the yeah.
in one of the sailor hats in the ringside. But Arcel said that that was the most that performance he claims that no heavyweight in history would be able to beat Dempsey the night that Dempsey beat Willard. And he was like, I was there and you saw the smoke rise from the arena. And he was like, that was the most vicious thing I've ever seen. And the way he was snarling and all that. No one would ever be able to beat Dempsey that night. No one was ever going to be Dempsey. Are you kidding me? Dempsey was a machine. Everyone would have followed to Dempsey. Like it's just it's a love affair, you know? And I
Yeah.
guess if we were around back then too, we probably feel the same way in 50 years' times. Who knows?
I mean, like there's probably some sliver of truth to what he's talking about in the sense that, yeah, dude, John Lester Johnson did supposedly beat his ass and break his ribs. And, that was also kind of like we were just saying, Dempsey's calling card, dude. He'd get his ass kicked in sparring pretty regularly. But he was also known for going all out in sparring, which is, kind of dumb, but he did all the time. And, he just didn't look good sometimes. But then there were also times, according to him and according to some others too, where like in some portions of his early career, he literally was like struggling financially, couldn't really afford to feed himself well, and was riding rails, not as like a lifestyle, but because he couldn't afford to travel places otherwise. And so, I mean, I'm sure that would affect you as a fighter. If any other fighter who's had to scrape by and be a fighter as they're scraping by and then gets fucking sponsorship and promoter, you know what I mean? They know the fucking difference between that. But that being said, yeah, dude, I mean, there's a ton of hyperbole surrounding Jack Dempsey. But all that said, all of the bashing of Jack Dempsey, we just said we're gonna get sued by the Dempsey family. But all the bashing of Jack Dempsey aside, that would have been an incredible card to say that you went to. Imagine being in like fucking like 1965, and you're like, yeah, when I was fucking 20, I saw Jack Dempsey defend the heavyweight title against Billy Miskey, and you know who else was on the card? Harry Greb and Sam Langford. What a time to be alive! That's
Yeah,
would have been
good
pretty
old
fucking
days.
crazy.
Has a cigar, chomping on a giant cigar in his mouth. Where the good old days, kids, man.
Eating
I'm
arsenic chips and
yeah.
eating arsenic chips and just fucking as the popcorn from the ceiling falls down and gives you cancer. It's great.
Yeah,
What a time to be alive.
watching Ali, Doug Jones, and be like, these kids today can't fight. Look at that one dance. What the hell is that? I'll show you what I used to do back.
You can't even knee in the balls anymore. What the
Yeah,
fuck is this?
get me Dempsey. Dempsey wipes them both out. I just go to his restaurant right now and ask him. He'll tell you. Um, but speaking of like again, like well, that's a great example because I'm gonna jump to 1979 for another example of something like that where a bunch of all-time legends appeared on the same card. And again, not necessarily in bouts that they weren't like that there was like even money fights in, but just the fact that they were all there in fights that people were like, wow, looking back, that card's like holy shit. And so you're going to Larry Holmes and Ernie Shavers in their rematch. So Larry Holmes, the heavyweight champion now, and still trying to earn some respect because he's still in the shadow of Ali, clearly, who's like retired, but just being a nuisance to everybody. And his early reign as champion has been a little just creaky, right? Because he beats Alfredo Evangelista, but everyone's like, okay, who gives a fuck? Knocks out Ozzy Ocasio, same thing, no one really cares. And then he gets knocked around the ring by a nondescript at that point, Mike Weaver, before he rallied to knock him out. So fighting Ernie Shavers in a big rematch. I mean, Shavers, even though he outpointed him, whitewashed him 12-0 in their first fight, fighting him in a rematch when Shavers is just like, just absolutely obliterated Ken Norton is intriguing. You know what I mean? Shavers has always been a favorite anyway, so that in
Yeah,
itself,
there were only a handful of little windows during his career where he was hot, and this was one of them.
yeah, everyone was really excited because I mean, he knocked the shit out of Norton. Like it's crazy to watch. You see Norton's face, and he's just like, I hate to say it, he looked like Jared Anderson after he got knocked out by Bacoli.
Yeah, just
I mean,
that
like
like
kind of similar
spaced
thing.
out like
Boom, boom, yeah, and you're just like, dog, what? And I love Costello's commentary at the end of that fight. He was like, Ernie Shavers resurrects his career, and for Kevin, he was like, and for Kenny Norton, heaven knows.
Yeah.
And Norton is just laying there half conscious, poor guy, bro.
Cosell did have some bullshit sometimes, but he did have some great calls too, where he would just say some shit, and you were like, "Yeah,
He just sounded so concerned for Norton. He was like, heaven knows, my God. But, so that's
get
the main.
him to a doctor."
And and then you have the other fights too. So you have Sugar Ray Leonard, fresh and getting close to a title shot now. It was looked upon either Wilfred Benitez or Pepino Cuevas for that matter. And he had a red hot 79 at that point, fighting. I think he had fought 7 times after that point because this was his eighth one. He was fighting Andy Price. Andy Price, I mean, even though Leonard was a big favorite, Andy Price was the NABF champion. He was a tough guy who had beaten both Carlos Palomino and Pepino Cuevas at one point,
Yeah,
and
huge amateur star. Yeah,
and was looked upon by a lot of people as like the uncrowned champion or a guy that definitely deserved a title shot. So that was a good fight, and that's the main undercard fight. And then on top of that, you have Roberto Duran, fresh from moving up from the lightweight division. That was a welterweight making his rounds over there, fighting, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not looking at it, Zeffy Garcia.
yep.
Or yeah,
Or Gonzalez, yeah, Zeffy Gonzalez.
Zeffy Gonzalez. And that's a fight that Duran was a heavy favorite to win, but Gonzalez was a competent pro who knew how to move, hence his nickname Speedy or Zeffy, whatever. And that was a good fight. And then on top of that, too, on the bottom one, you have Wilfredo Gomez, who ends up becoming one of the all-time greats, making another title defense. I mean, that's a stacked card from top to bottom.
Yeah, especially they got one last thrill during the main event too, with Holmes going down that way, dude.
Oh, yeah, yeah, totally.
Dude, that shit would have been great. I mean, not to say that every single fight on that card would have been fantastic or turned out, like every round was great or something like that. But again, that's what you're fucking risking when you're going with a bunch of fights. But again, seeing all these names, seeing a lot of these fighters too, basically in their prime or about as close to it as you could possibly get, especially with Holmes, Leonard, and Duran. I mean, not too far from it at
And
all.
Wilfredo Gomez, too, for that matter.
Yeah, actually, yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah, still
I mean,
undefeated.
yeah. So Gomez, does what he did. I think he scored a knockout. I don't know how spectacular it was, but he beat his opponent down. Duran won a nondescript decision. It wasn't a very exciting fight. Leonard, with the knockout of the night, I mean, that was Jesus Christ. He almost killed poor Andy Price. That was a nasty knockout. And a surprising one, in fact, too, because a lot of people expected, not that anyone expected Leonard to lose. He was a heavy favorite in the fight. It was the fact that a lot of people thought the fight would go rounds. Price was a
Yeah.
very respected fighter. No one really ever blew out Price like that before.
And he, as part of his management team, Lee Majors, Marvin Gaye, and
Yeah,
who was Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds.
that's right. That's right. Um, yeah, what an interesting combo that is.
Who were all extremely dude, that was a weird, like, especially in LA, right around, like, a lot of the like the Olympic, a lot of fighters who fought out of or around the Olympic were trained out of the Main Street Gym and shit like that. A whole bunch of celebrities were always trying to get in, like the 1970s and early 80s, trying to get into like management and co-management and stuff like that. And what's his name, what was that dude?
Like
Oh,
Fox.
Ryan O'Neal. Yeah, Ryan O'Neal. Yeah, I mean, like,
Like
there were a,
Fox had a heavyweight. I don't remember if you remember Fred Hope. He named young Sanford.
yep, that's right. There were a bunch of in like the 1970s and 80s. There were a bunch of celebrities who tried to get in on it. But I mean, point being that at least for Andy Price, I think that probably helped his popularity.
Absolutely. But a side story to that too is that, like you mentioned, Marvin Gaye. Um, from what I've read, allegedly Gaye he bet his entire like everything he had on Price winning. Like he was convinced that Price was going to win that night, and he just bet all of his funds and all of that on a Price victory.
I think that he like
Um,
put a lot of money toward like his training camp and shit like that too. Yeah.
But like he dropped everything on, betting that, thinking that he was going to make a major cash out on Price winning. And well, clearly that spectacularly did not happen as he was knocked out in the first round. And if you watch him, because Marvin Gaye performed the national anthem before Home Shavers, you can even see it in his face. Like he's like kind of disturbed and like, he's like got some shit on his mind. Like if you once I read that and went back and watched it, you can clearly see that
That
like
fool hit Rocket's red glare and just
yeah, like my boy
held
is
it.
like he's sang it, and I mean like Marvin was the best of all time at singing the national anthem in my opinion, but like oh man, yeah, I felt for him. I really felt for him. You can almost see in his face that like he's just really trying to hold it together, but that dude knows he just lost it all. It was incredible.
That sucks.
Yeah, it's that's wild.
Jesus.
But
Yeah,
yeah, that's
Ray
that's
Leonard
I
breaking
mean
hearts
top
back
to
then.
bottom. Yeah, top to bottom, that's an incredibly stacked card.
No question, dude. That's about as stacked a card as you're gonna get at that point. Michael Dokes being handed his first fucking or well, I should say moving forward and handing Jimmy Young. Gosh, that couldn't have been his last fight, but
Who, Jimmy Young?
yeah, no
Jimmy
way.
Young lasted up until around 1990.
Yeah, because I think he still was trying to come back. Yeah, good God, that's not even
Oh, bro,
close to.
Jimmy Young actually had like a comeback of the year around like 1981 or so. He had like or 81 or 82. He had a nice little run going for himself again. Yeah, I know.
Yikes! Dynamite Dokes, bro. What could have been?
I mean, I love Doak. As a fighter, Dokes was a brilliant, brilliant guy. Outside the ring, that's a whole different story of what I won't get into, but yeah. But I mean, that's again, look at that was the type of potential that Don used to put on or like things like that. But then if I mean, I'm sorry I keep on just using him as an example, but I mean, this is just like the cards that he did. So like let's move forward really quick though, because we've talked about this I think off the show the other day, the early 2000s. So Don King, we said, remember the shifts. Showtime has always been there, Showtime and HBO has always had their own thing. Don King back in the 80s was an HBO guy. He was supplying the majority of shows for HBO was Don King things, whether it was his heavyweight tournament that he had. And so he was constantly supplying them Trevor Burbick and Pinkel Thomas and Greg Page and all of his other retreads until Mike Tyson finally came in and cleared that shit up. But they also had Chavez. They also had just anyone else back then, like, Michael Spinks and all these other guys. Butch Lewis came in a little bit, but like Don was that main dude. Then they had a falling out in the early 90s when Tyson and Don wanted Larry Merchant to be fired, and HBO decided to keep him. That was among other things. So they decided to get rid of him. So Don and Mike decided to jump ship to Showtime, which was fledgling and definitely needed their support. And Don at that point also brought Tyson, Terry Norris, Chavez, and the rest of his roster over there. So that's when he supplied them for basically till the end of the decade, right? Until after that, the early 2000s, HBO debuts around 2000 and what was it 2002 was their legendary night show.
It was either 2001 or 2002, but that sounds about right, right around there. Yeah.
And yeah, so they had their legendary nights episodes. Don King is supplying a lot of the footage for those shows, right? With the fights that they're covering. I mean, main events has a lot of them too, and Aram has a few, but like Don is central focus for, I mean, he is like the Tyson ones and a few others. So you see a lot of that footage, and I want to say I'm not sure if this was the case or not, and if anyone listening can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the people involved that were supplying footage and like giving the rights to them and stuff also got pay-per-views, got like dates out of that. Like HBO dates. By this time, Don was already kind of done with Showtime because Showtime finally like got the light and we're just like, yo, we're not dealing with you and your exclusivity shit anymore. Like you out. And that's when Jay Larkin was like, we're just gonna pick the best promoters who give us the best fights and we're just gonna go forward doing that. And so Don kind of needed a home to go back with his host again. And so he went to HBO. And that's when you started seeing the early 2000s, like, him having random cards and also these random ass marathon cards. And these are the first ones that I want to say, there was always been like a running joke back in the day with like Brighters and other ones talking about, oh, Don has these 18-hour cards, man. You got to get there at like, 11 in the morning to see the WBA junior flyweight champion. Defend his belt. And sometimes they would like either open they would have a fight open to the public like they did that for Terry Norris. I think when he screwed himself against what's his face? The guy got disqualified against Luis Santana.
Yeah.
And then, also Bernard Hopkins and what's his name too, Joe Lipsy. Like those were free to the public. Those were aired on like ABC or some shit. But once Don realized, oh, I can put all my fights on each on just pay-per-view now. You mean I could take like 6 and 7 fights? You gonna air all them bitches? Bet. And that's what he did in the early 2000s when he came back and he had those random shows where he literally was almost taking every champion he had and stacking it on. And instead of that shit starting at like a normal time, which would be perfect for anybody, especially on the East Coast at like 6 p.m., it still started at like 8 or 9. So we were watching Bernard Hopkins against William Joppy starting at like 2 in the morning.
That's probably the best example too, because I remember that shit. I remember not only watching the card, God, dude, I need like holy water just thinking about it. But like, I remember not only watching the card, but I do remember leading up to it and thinking like, damn, that shit sounds fucking good because that is like a marathon card. There's a bunch of fucking title fights on the card. And on top of that, Don was still very much in the game. He had a whole bunch of champions in his stable, or at the very least signed to like, on like the short term and stuff like that. And so at least on paper, it looked like a fucking good card, bro. I mean, it was stacked.
I'm trying to bring it up right now to see exactly who was on it.
So down at the very bottom, you got Luis Alberto Perez versus Felix Machado, which
Yep.
that was the rematch of their first fight. Which, if you watched that shit, was a banger, bro. Fucking, I don't even know if it's on YouTube, but if it is, you should go watch it because that shit's a banger. Definitely underrated. Felix Machado winds up with his head just fucking swollen half off
Oh,
and
I
shit.
remember him. Didn't he used to wear like Bic pencil trunks? I think he was sponsored by Bic,
Maybe he might have.
which was actually pretty cool. But yeah, I remember Machado from the early 2000s.
I mean, like he faded like extremely quickly, but yeah, dude, the first fight with Perez was a banger. So like that shit was that was like the lowest fight on the card or whatever.
Mhm.
And then Travis Sims, Tarvis and Travis Sims, the fighting twins. And when I say fighting, I mean fighting each other constantly in the news, getting into fights. Dudes just couldn't stop fighting each other.
Bro,
Dumbasses.
did
But
I ever tell you? I'm sorry. Did I ever tell you the first time I attended a Showtime card was in 2002 for my buddy Jason Pyres when he fought Rocky Juarez. And I don't know how it was. I wasn't there with no VIP or nothing. Me and my parents just got tickets. But we were sitting in the audience and Tarvis, not Travis, but Tarvis ends up sitting either in front of us or behind us, right? And we ended up having a conversation with him. He's a nice enough guy. Like I didn't even know he was a fighter or who he was, but we just ended up chit chatting. And he was cool, and he knew Jason, so he was getting into it. And then some guy during the fight when Jason got hurt and someone heckled, Tarvis got up and like his wife had to visibly restrain him, beating the shit out of a guy right in front of us, like right there immediately. Yeah, what the fuck you saying about my boy? And he jumped at his wife just like on instinct though, because this apparently was like a reoccurring thing. Just grabbed him and like sat him back down. And I'm like, whoa.
I believe it because I literally remember more about them being in the news for fighting one another than I do any of their fights. 100%. I'm being totally serious. Like I just remember they were both like kind of boxer puncher, like kind of anyway. But that shit, he's fighting Alex Garcia, fucking Zab Judah, Jaime Rangel, um, Braithwaite, Pineda. I remember that shit too. Actually, Wayne Braithwaite was like, I think I
Big
want
fuck.
to, yeah, and I want to say that was he was coming off of that hilarious knockout of Vincenzo Cannatore, where Cannatore is like complaining to the ref, and Braithwaite just hits his fucking head off. That shit was funny. I'm not gonna lie. And then Rosendo Alvarez versus Jose Burgos, like you said, Hopkins Joppy. Oh God, Corey Spinks versus Ricardo Mayorga. That shit just gives me pain. And then even somehow more pain, John Ruiz versus Hasim Rahman. God, just some of the worst fights ever right
Fucking
there.
dreck.
So bad, dude.
And like big fights too. I mean, for what they were, Spinks Mayorga
They were
was
like significant.
yeah, that was a significant fight. Ruiz Rockman was a significant fight. And ugh. But that again, those weren't even the only ones. That just became like a theme for him where like for whatever reason he had a few of those. And I don't think that, I mean they were HBO pay-per-view distributed, but I'm not even sure if the HBO like if it was the actual announce team, like the usual announce team for them or not. I don't remember that.
I'm
But
not gonna lie, I don't remember either.
only click on John Ruiz because I knew he had a couple of them too after that. He probably headlined for whatever god awful reason. Um yeah, like let me look at the Okendo card. I know this one sucked. Yep, same thing. Okay, that first fight definitely didn't get aired. Collazo, no. Gerald Nobles, Willie Williams. Okay. Ricardo Mayorga, Eric Mitchell, that definitely aired. Braithwaite, Louis Azale, that aired. Bird Galata. That was a good fight. That
That
was
yeah,
a,
that actually was surprisingly good. Yeah,
and then Ruiz Okendo,
which
which is
was surprisingly bad.
not that surprisingly. I mean, I think
Yeah,
everyone
no, there was no surprise about that at all.
yeah, everyone knew that was gonna be like one of the worst fucking fights ever. But my God, that fight sucked. I think I think the referee just stopped it because he was just more out of mercy. Like I can't deal with this shit anymore, as opposed to all that. But you know,
Yeah, he had a hand, but that was kind of like you could see that his shit was starting to trail off, though. Like you
Mhm.
could even just see on the quality of that card, shit was starting to trail off a little bit, and he was starting to lose his hold on a number of these fighters. And not long after that, he did. You know, he wasn't around too much long after that in a significant way, or at least he was like he kind of concentrated on the cruiserweight division for a minute, and then like that was basically it.
Oh yeah, I know. And he had like Zab Judah and a few others and stuff. But I mean, yeah, it's his drop off was like significant and swift. Kind of incredible when you think about how fast it happened. I mean, it can happen with the best of you too. Like once people start leaving and then you never really actually change with the times and you never update anything, including your fucking website and other things like that, you eventually get lost. You just get lost in the past. And he did, Cedric did, unfortunately. And I feel more bad for Cedric because Cedric never really got that, and he was one of the top promoters in the world and he was living like the good life for a minute, but at the same time, anytime he had like a guy out for a significant victory, they defect from him quickly. And so I felt more bad for him than as opposed to King because King was the one who was doing shit like that. King stole
Yeah.
Rockmont from him, and then Shane Mosley dipped from him immediately after beating De La Hoya, so on and so forth. Like there's, but you also have to change with the times, and you also have to try to like stay ahead of the game, and like
Yeah.
sometimes you can't do that. And if you can't do that, then well.
It sucks to dismiss it this way, but boxing is cutthroat, dude, and you do have to get into it knowing that, and knowing that if you're a nice person or if you do nice things or have the intention of helping people, you're going to get undercut, you're going to get pushed out, you're going to get stomped on, whatever. And the only consolation that Cedric really has is that history does remember that, and I do remember writers saying it at the time. Writers saying, getting on Hasim Rahman's ass, especially. That was probably the big one where he got lured away from Cedric Kushner to Don King, kind of understandably, but that a number of writers were like, where's the fucking loyalty? You know what I mean? Like this guy got you here and you're just about to bounce. That's fucked up. That's like one of the oldest stories in boxing, you
Totally.
know? So
So his last big, weird marathon pay-per-view he had was another one at Madison Square Garden. He was starting to promote there again. And this one has Oliver McCall, DeVarrell Williamson. Eh, not awful. I mean, for what it was, McCall was fun. Evander Holyfield, Larry Donald. That was just sad as
I
fuck to
remember
watch.
that. Yeah. God,
Yeah.
especially seeing Larry Donald styling on Holyfield like that. It was like Larry Donald
Of
though.
all people, Larry Donald.
Jesus Christ. I was like, wow, dude, this is like the early 90s heavyweight fight that we never wanted, but we're somehow getting now. What the fuck?
And Holyfield was just a broken down car in that fight, just chuckling along,
Yeah, it
couldn't move,
was,
slow. And Donald just sitting there with that stupid jab and dancing along. Oh, it was so. I hate that fight so much. I hate that fight
yeah,
so much.
that was like depressing, dude.
Yeah. Hasim Rahman, Kali Meehan. That was a beatdown and a half. John Ruiz, Andrew Galata, which again, that wasn't a bad. Give Galata credit in his in that weird comeback that he had in the early
Yeah,
two.
he should have won two titles.
Yes, and
That's
they
the
were
funny
bad
thing.
fights, and they were against guys that are usually in horrendous fights. Chris Bird was never known to be an exciting guy
Yeah, and he
whatsoever.
somehow made both of them watchable.
In the Ruiz fight, which admittedly is worse than the Bird fight, but I mean still watchable because he dropped Ruiz and was like made him fight. And then Stoney's antics.
Yeah, and Stony going wild. Yeah, somehow, dude, there was always something with Galata fights. Like every fucking Galata fight, there was something.
I mean, Don definitely got his money out of him because he pimped him out to three of those fights. Like he got him that, and then after that, because he looked so good in those fights, he got him against who was it, Lehman Brewster
Yeah.
in
Oh
Chicago.
God, dude. Yeah, and then in Chicago too, like so many Polish fans there, and he just gets fucking wiped out in like 30 seconds. Fuck.
And then at that point, you can't bring him back anymore.
No,
There's only
yeah,
so
no,
much
it's
you can
done. It's over.
do.
And then fucking Adamek. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that was the nail in the. Come on, bad.
I did get to watch him live once though against Kevin McBride at MSG.
That would have been a
And
spectacle.
oh, bro, that was a fun fight. All right, I was first off, that was a fun ass fight because it was just a brawl. You know what I mean? Ride was just walking in, waiting, and fat, and just getting beat up, and Gallardo was beating the shit out of him. But that was the first time I got to witness the Polish fans like that live. Before I started, going to Adamek fights
They
and see.
show out for their fool, dude.
Oh,
They don't
bro,
mess
they were
around.
showing up for him. They were hyped. You know what I mean? Like they immediately just made me think of like Bo Galata.
Yeah, you're like,
They
I could see how this happened.
straight up, because I started seeing them. They all had the bandanas around their head, and they were just like, "Ah, yeah, go Galata," and just
You're like, yeah, I could see how this happened. Fucking well, the only other one that I actually had on my, if you want to call it a list, I was lucky enough to actually be there, and I don't even know if you'd want to call it like a stacked card. It just so happened that the top or main three fights on it were good, and that was Marco Antonio Barrera versus Rocky Juarez rematch.
that's a great one because I was thinking of that one too.
And
Yeah,
I thankfully was there. But yeah, the other fights on the card were not, really much to write about, to be honest. It's just that those main three were good.
totally. And that's featured. What was it? Johnny Gonzalez against uh
The late Israel Vasquez, yeah.
yeah. Johnny Gonzalez, Israel Vasquez, and what was the other one?
Jorge Barrios versus Joan Guzman, and Guzman wound up like kind of.
Styling
I
up.
didn't really think it was much of a split decision. I thought Guzman clearly won, but it was
Yeah.
like it was an entertaining fight though.
That was a great card. I mean, especially because I don't think anyone. I mean, I think people were excited for Vasquez and Johnny Gonzalez, but I don't think anyone expected it to be as good as it was. Like Gonzalez was moving up in weight for that fight, wasn't he?
No, or actually, I think that he was at bantamweight. I just don't know if he was moving up for that fight. He might have been.
He might have, yeah, because was
You
that he
might be
was,
right.
that junior featherweight, wasn't it?
It was, but now, well, regardless of the timeline, you might be right. You very well might be right. He won the WBO bantamweight title like not long before that. And there's actually one of the early fights that I don't even know if it's on YouTube, but you have to go find it. There's a fucking early fight of Johnny Gonzalez versus another dude named William Gonzalez, where they were trading knockdowns and shit, and it's like a second or third round knockout. It was a couple of years before this. But anyway, um, yeah, I guess he was moving up in weight. You're right. And even so, it looked like, for the first handful of rounds, the first like maybe 7 or 8 rounds, it was like, damn, Johnny Gonzalez got this shit in the bag.
Oh yeah, he was beating the shit out of Vasquez. It was one of those fights that when he came back to rally and stop him, that was a brilliant performance.
He ain't never got
And
nothing in the bag against Israel Vasquez.
oh no, man. And that's the thing that we love about Vasquez too, is that as much as we remember his fights with Marquez, obviously the trilogy, because fuck that fourth fight. Um, you got to look back at like the fights he had with Oscar Larios, which was like incredible too, especially
Underrated, yeah.
that second fight that they had when he gets stopped in it in the last round. That was a brilliant fight. And then again with Johnny Gonzalez, because like he gets dropped, he's getting outboxed, and Gonzalez was just one of those lanky, tough guys who could fucking crack, and just brilliant, really, really good fighter in himself, who would go on to knock out Abner Maris a few years after that, shockingly. But yeah, the way that Vasquez came back, that was a great performance. And I mean, when that was competitive fights too, because look at it, that first Juarez and Barrera fight, that was one of those fights that like Barrera was controlling it up until the very end, and then Juarez finally broke through, and then Barrera just looked like a roadside victim near the end of it, while Juarez, came on. All worth it. And that was during an era of pay-per-views too, where like sometimes you didn't know what you were gonna get because like yeah, if the pay-per-views would get put on, they would be somewhat stacked or like they were getting better, like we said, more from moving on from the 90s, right? But at the same time, it was still like you didn't sometimes they would put fights on pay-per-view that would just make you a head scratcher. Like they did it twice with Barrera. back then when they had Barrera fight Mazanki Fana on pay-per-view, and then they had him fight Kevin Kelly, who was completely washed. And you're like, why are these on pay-per-view? Like, I understand you only have so many dates you can do something for, but like, do these necessarily need to be on pay-per-view? Why
Yeah,
am I
do we even need that fight at all? Like,
and I
not
think you
really.
still were paying like $50 for it or some shit. Like, I don't think they were being discounted just because of what it was, you know? And it's like, that's crazy. But the last one I'm just going to bring up, and I think you were at this one too. And I just want to say this is kind of like Revenge of the Rematches, where in terms of like you have two of the best fights of the year, and they're on the same card again now for a rematch, and everyone's super excited about it, and it just doesn't really pan out that way. So that's Jose Luis Castillo and Diego Corrales for their rematch.
Yeah, I will say that was fun, and I was thankful to be at that. And I've joked about the fucking first fight on more than one occasion because you will find like 50,000 people who were at the first fight when the actual attendance was like 1,500 or something like that. You know? Like the people you like were there were just like not even anybody alive who was at the fucking first fight at this point. But yeah, that shit was crazy, dude. That whole dynamic between Diego Corrales and Jose Luis Castillo in general, like both inside the ring and out, was just kind of weird, kind of contentious.
Hmm.
Um, it was definitely the first fight was one of those. It was one of those fights where all the hardcore fans knew it. You know, if you followed the lightweight division in the early 2000s, you knew that it was pretty stacked, that it was a tough division, that there were a lot of kind of 140-pound dudes who had moved up away from lightweight. And, you know, it was a really good division. And on top of that, Diego Corrales was making his comeback from doing time in prison, and he was away from the sport for a little bit. And was in the midst of his comeback. Jose Luis Castillo was kind of on the other end of he was still at lightweight after Floyd Mayweather had a close fight with him in the first fight and then clearly beat him in the rematch, but then moved up to 140 and Castillo was still there. So he kind of just, you know, hung around and dominated or for the most part in his wake. And so fans knew.
Yep.
We knew what this was, dude. We didn't know it was gonna be like that. Nobody did. Nobody was fucking. That shit was one of the wildest fights I've ever seen from start to finish. I mean, there have been wilder, but almost none on that level. And that shit was crazy. And so there didn't really need to be much hype for the rematch, but there was, and it obviously, thankfully, grew from there. Like that, there was more eyes on the rematch, more people cared about the rematch, and so yeah, I remember we went to Vegas. I was so absolutely ridiculously drunk, like the entire weekend. It was a total shit show. You know, but the fight itself, I mean, and it's actually kind of underrated too. There was a big fucking the whole weight fucking thing. A lot of people forget about this and or don't remember the details of what happened. But real quickly, I remember we got there and it was Friday and it was like right at it was either like as the weigh-in was happening or right after the weigh-in. Kids, you know, cover your ears or parents cover your kids' ears. We totally fucking drank on the way to Vegas. So we were drunk as fuck by the time we got there. So I don't remember all the details about whether we got there right after the weigh in or as the weigh in was happening. But I was getting texts about it because people were saying, oh, you know, somebody was pulling some shit. They might cancel the fight. And I'm like, we just fucking got here. We're drunk. They might cancel the fight. What's going on, bro? And thankfully, they didn't cancel the fight. But what wound up happening was that, if I'm not mistaken, it was Jose Luis Castillo's personal physician, like it's like the doctor that travels with him and that he hired or some shit. As Castillo was weighing in, they supposedly knew he was not going to hit 135 pounds. So the doctor went up and tried to stick his foot in that little gap. I don't know if you, I know you
Oh yeah,
have.
yeah, 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 yeah. I remember that.
I know you have stepped on one of those scales, and most people who have been to like the doctor have stepped onto those kind of scales. Like they use digital ones now, but back in 2005, they were still using the ones that you do the little, you know, the
Yep.
rail where you're like ding, ding,
Yeah, yeah,
ding,
yeah,
that thing.
totally.
And so on most of those, there's like this big platform that you step onto, and then there's like a little gap between the platform and then the lower platform that it sits on. And the doctor tried to stick his fucking foot underneath the platform that you stand on in order, I guess, to lighten the weight, you know, to push up with his foot. With okay, so it was immediately obvious by the commissioners like what he was trying to do, and he got caught. And so they basically then they weighed him and he came in fucking heavy and they were like, "Oh, okay." So it was clear what they were trying to fucking pull, but they wound up just paying Diego Corrales to go through with it. Supposedly there was a big behind the scenes to do because Diego Corrales was like not sure if he was going to go through with it, but they talked him into it, and you can understand that there's a lot of pressure. You're the in part of the main event for this big multi-million-dollar show. It's up to you whether or not you want to pull out or not because you were contracted for a fight 135 pounds. That didn't happen. This dude broke the contract. So as far as legally, you just fucking bounce. You don't got to do shit. But according to, allegedly, he was talked into fucking still fighting and he fought him anyway. There was no real safeguards there and he got knocked out badly. So anyway, yeah, sorry for the big backstory, but I remember that shit. It was a fun time and it was a good card.
It was, but it was one of those that people were just like, okay, everyone assumed that it was going to be like the first fight in terms of like the craziness
Exactly.
back and
Yeah.
forth. And then Jorge Arce, who was always never in a bad fight in his entire career against Hussein, their first fight was one of the best fights of that previous year. Or was it that same year they had the fight? I don't know. But
It was earlier that year, and it was in April, I believe, because that was which is another card we could bring up. Eric Morales versus Manny Pacquiao won. It was on an undercard of that.
oh, that was a great card, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Arce Hussein, who they air that fight kind of frequently on the Top Rank Tubi channel. And it's an incredible fight. I mean, Arce back then was just like you couldn't if Arce was going to be on television, you didn't want to miss it. Like either if he was going to beat a guy up in kind of like a squash or whatever it was, it just things were always fun for him. I got to see him fight live once and it was awesome and just like a cool ass dude. You know what I mean? He had the lollipop, everything around. He didn't care if he got bloodied. He didn't care if he got knocked down. He didn't care if he was smaller than you. He was going to get in your ass and beat you up and try to eventually stop you. And just wonderful, wonderful fighter. But their first fight was incredible. Hussein was taking a tremendous beating because Arce was just visibly stronger than him, but he was also in the pocket and fighting back and hurting Arce. And also, then he cut him, like gave him a nasty cut on his
yeah,
was just bleeding like
yeah.
horrendously.
That was
And
one of the great like post-fight photos where his face is like covered in blood and he's got like a massive gash, but he's just fucking celebrating.
that's right. He had his sombrero on. He's still like cheering. He has his hands up and he's going in. He's hyped. And I mean, yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. But uh, when it comes to the rematch, I mean, he just blows this dude out like out of the water. It's not even competitive. Hussein, who clearly got a little bit taken out of that fight from the brutality of the first one, has nothing left in this, and he gets knocked senseless. And then, Corrales, like you said, he has the weight issues and all that, and a guy Castillo who's clearly bigger than him and stronger, and Corrales, who always struggled with weight, and it's unfortunate for him that he had to deal with that while Castillo kind of blew it. He just gets bludgeoned, and Corrales is one of those guys that, as
It,
much
it
as I
was
love
a
him,
fun fight while it lasted, but it was
oh
just,
yeah,
just you
yeah,
could
for
tell that one guy
rounds,
was stronger.
clearly. And like the thing about I love Corrales to death and all that, but he had the biggest heart on the planet, but he wasn't the most durable guy either. Like he can get dropped, he didn't his chin could be cracked and he would get like lanky guys, you hit them hard enough, sometimes they go down. And Corrales would go down and he would go down hard. He was again another great undercard fight, but not necessarily a stat card like Holyfield. What was it, Holyfield and James Toney because he fought Joel Casamayor, their first fight, and another one of those like premature kind of stoppage. Well, not premature because Corrales' lip was completely shredded and shit, but like premature in the sense that like you knew there was a lot left of like in both guys that like still keep going.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're
Yeah,
just like,
that shit was
oh, man,
brutal.
that's bullshit that happened. I mean, it was a nasty cut. The fight definitely had to be stopped. Lip cuts are the absolute worst. Those are the ones who really that actually gross me out. Like I can handle cut eyes for whatever reason, busted noses, but like seeing a lip just get like shredded and then just knowing it's hanging, dog.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, Jorge Barrios versus
Yeah,
Rocky
I'm
Juarez. That shit was so bad. He like they're like sorry, but the fucking during that fight, the fucking I can't remember who the referee is off the top of my head, but he got knocked down, and then when he got up, the referee saw his lip. The referee goes and makes this face like holy shit, and I'm like, oh no, it must be bad because he hadn't even turned to the camera yet, and then he turned to the camera, and you're like, oh god, no, like stop the fight. Yeah, that shit was bad, bro. No question. Yeah, and then like to the fight, the main event for between Castillo and Corrales in that rematch, it was better than it's remembered for being now because everybody remembers the knockout, but it was clear kind of as it was happening what was happening. And also on the undercard, Bobby Pacquiao versus Carlos Hernandez, which was, I know, like that sounds dumb, but people were looking at that fight like, oh, it's Manny Pacquiao's brother, and like he's kind of like got some fame on him now. Carlos Hernandez not a bad fighter, but it didn't end up so good.
Yeah, well, Pacquiao's brother, what was that weird time during the early 2000s, early or mid 2000s, I guess, where he was starting to make appearances on Pacquiao's undercard. And then also too, remember when what did Top Rank, were they on Versus? What the fuck were they on back then? I don't know, different networks,
Don't
remember?
even. Yeah, they were on a couple. They were kind of shopping around during that time, I
And
think.
then and that's when like, oh, we're on television, we're on network television, but here's Ty Fields in the main event, like shit like that. But yeah, they were putting Bobby Pacquiao in different things, and I mean, he aside from looking like his brother because they look almost exactly alike and kind of having the same build and kind of the same style. I mean, the dude was like, a discounted Timu version of Pacquiao when it came down.
Yeah, dude.
Well, they were able to feed him, fucking washed up Kevin Kelly and, beat up withered Hernandez, who probably should have beat Pacquiao that night. He got robbed by all accounts, but it's like, yeah. But
Yeah. Although he did, I will say, give us a fantastic post-fight quote with the, "Isn't that the blow blow? That's not the blow blow, man. Come on."
for what fight was that? The Hernandez one?
The Hector
Oh, he
Velasquez.
got disqualified against Velasquez.
Yeah, you got the
Yeah.
DQ, and then they're like, "So, Bobby, can you tell us what happened? That's not the blow blow. That's not blow blow, man." It's fucking great. Love it.
But yeah, I mean, now, when just to, I guess to finalize it all, now it's just a common theme that like cards are just stacked the fuck up. Like it started happening in Showtime in the late 2000s, early 2010s, I guess, when remember that one card where like it made a bit everyone made a big deal about it because it was the first time they were airing like 4 or 5 fights or whatever when Antonio Tarver headlined against Latif Coyote.
Oh God, that was yeah, that was a mistake, but yes.
But that was a long stat card. I think Peter Quillen was against Winky Wright on that,
Oh
and
God, yeah, that was
uh, there was
mistake.
a couple other guys too on, you know what I mean? But yeah, Leo Santa Cruz I think made his first appearance. There was a couple, but that was a long one, and then it started like the trend though.
Oh, I've clicked so many box rec links it thinks I'm a robot.
Oh, they
Sorry,
did the same to me earlier.
sorry,
Hmm.
box. Yeah, they're like, dude, you're usurping our fucking bandwidth. What are you doing? Yeah, I was just gonna say, I actually remember too because people, I remember that was when I was still in San Diego, and people are like, oh, you should come up for this card, and I was like,
Yep.
respectfully, no, I'm good, dude. Like, it's got Austin Trout, Delvin Rodriguez, and this does not have the makings of a fucking fantastic action card, to be honest, and it
No.
wasn't.
Absolutely. And it was a drag. But then that started like the whole idea of, hey, we can start, doing these long cards. HBO never really did it. Once in a blue moon, they would do 3 fights. And, especially like later on when they would like their Superfly card or something like that.
Yeah.
But they always just kind of usually stuck to the true and blue of just doing 2 fights.
Yep.
Showtime started doing multiple cards because they felt, okay, this first one, like people liked it. They'll watch boxing all day. And even then, they would have like 3 fights in the main card and then they would do Show Extreme. Remember Show
Yeah, I was
Extreme?
I was just about to say they do like sometimes even for like a few hours on Showtime Extreme, which I mean for like sicko fucking boxing fans like you and I and other people who are gonna watch whatever boxing you put in front of them, that's great. But
Sure.
also I think that one less there if there is a lesson to take away from this show too, and that's that not everything needs to be jammed on there, not everything needs to be
Yeah.
televised, not you know what I'm saying, like not everything, we don't need to see everything.
That's what we've gotten to today now is that like every card needs to be stacked. Every time we watch a show, it needs to have at least 4 or 5 fights on it at a minimum now. Do we need 5 fights at a minimum? That's a long ass thing. And the way fights are always spread out and no one knows how to pace a card ever.
Oh
They're
God, yeah,
getting
it's
better
tough,
at it.
dude.
They're getting better at it, but these Riyadh season cards are hard because like,
Well,
think
even paced well, some of them are fucking long. Some of
in
them
this
are like,
yeah. And this one's gonna
bro,
be long as shit.
I'm 42, dog. So that means like, come like fight five, I'm like, I'm fading, dude. I'm struggling.
And
So
don't even, yeah, I mean, think about that Shakur fight too, man. I'm just like, oh boy, with the replacement that they found for him, I'm like, bro, that's gonna be like a definition of straining myself to like, but but that's the thing is that like everything now is that this is the norm is that we need to have these cards, and if you're gonna do a big card like the Riyadh ones out in Saudi Arabia, something like that, be prepared that they're gonna have like 8 or 9 fights or some shit on it, and they're gonna air all of them. And the fact that he stacks them with so many names, he thinks that that's okay. Well, then you're gonna watch all of them. It's your bang for your buck and all that. But like asking someone to sit down for 8 hours of their day and sit there and watch boxing like that is pretty great. Is a toll. It is. That would be a toll for any sport. Like man,
yep.
people can do it. They definitely do it. When it comes to anything, like when it comes to like football and people have like 14 different screens on or whatever it may be, but just like it's a taxing thing to do that. And so, but here we are. This is where we're at now in boxing. We take it off of network television. You have to have this paywall now for everything with DAZN and everything else because God forbid we have to have a niche sport. You know what I mean? It needs to be a niche sport. God forbid it just can be out to the masses like it used to be. But not
Oh
only that,
God, yeah.
they try to say, oh, well, if you're paying for it, well, we're giving you 18 fights on this card. So, you're getting your bang for your buck.
I mean, on one, I guess you don't have to watch it if you don't want to. That's one
Sure.
perspective. So on one hand, I do kind of appreciate that they are at least giving us the option of watching as much as we possibly can. But
Yeah.
yeah, it does wind up sometimes being a lot, dude. Winds up sometimes being a whole fucking lot. But, I will say, they did at least put some effort into the card this weekend. And they
Yeah,
did
absolutely.
did put together some fights that are more than worthwhile. I'm hoping, praying, wondering that the replacement fight, if they do wind up having a replacement for Joseph Parker and Daniel Dubois, let's hope that it's a good one. But we get what we get. We don't get too upset unless we're on the show and then we just bitch for 2 hours. But no, dude, look, history. We did the history of stacked cards. I think we did a not a comprehensive job, of course, but a pretty decent job of traveling around as far as the time frames and the eras. Not too bad. I appreciate it, bro. But
Went
look,
back over 100 years, bro.
yeah, we need to get out of here. The reason being, you need to get all the fucking rest that you can to count the card this weekend, man.
Man, you know what? I think at this point I'm used to Turkey's marathon cards. I'm pretty good at it. But at the same point, definitely it's a good thing to get rest up and have plenty of excuse me, like Celsius or whatever them energy drinks I like.
At the very least, you're keeping the shroud of fucking mystery here as far as who you're counting. Thank goodness. So nobody can blame you. Nobody knows. Nobody knows what's going on.
Yeah, I'm not worried about that. My shit's always on point. But it's gonna be a good card, and this is the thing about boxing now is that at least what's been becoming the norm for pay-per-view or big events is that people, at least I can say this now that the promoters, it seems like, have put into the effort that they're like, you know what, that we can actually stack this shit up as opposed to just making it be like, okay, it's gonna be like a black card. Like, um, Turkey's doing it with Riyadh season most like what this show's been putting on, and PBC for their to their credit too. Their price point is like outrageous compared to what Riyadh is doing, like $80 for a show compared to like 20 or whatever, but that's a whole different
Yeah,
subject.
yeah. We obviously know, there's more to the discussion than that,
Totally,
but it
but
is a
that
fair point.
sure. Absolutely. But that being said, you got to give both sides credit because they're at least being mindful of being like, you know what, we got to stack these cards up now. We can't just give them absolute bullshit unless it's out of our control at the last third of a minute. We want to keep this guy on and find him anybody. But like, you know,
No, and they are, employing matchmakers who are putting some thought into it. So, as a boxing fan, I do appreciate that there's at least going to be some consolidation of a fight card that I can watch and kind of like knock out a bunch of big fights at once. But it is a marathon. However, as a fan, I can't really complain that much about it. You know what I mean? People trying to give me a whole bunch of fights. Twist my arm, why don't you? You know?
seriously.
Hey, dude, I appreciate it, man, because I know that you did some homework. I did a little bit of homework. Got to teach these foos some lessons, gives them some shit to steal. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. More the merrier.
Yeah. Go steal the fucking material. All right, everybody. Well, hey, man, I again appreciate it. And everybody who listened in, watched, we appreciate you. Thank you so much. Go ahead and if you did listen in on any of the podcast apps, go ahead and subscribe, leave a rating. Always appreciated. Kind of knocks us up on the little search function, I think. And then on YouTube, similarly, subscribe, leave a comment. I'll probably ignore it because I'm socially weird. But that being said, speaking of socially weird, follow us on social media where we're also socially weird there. Should be a lot of fun. Eris, we'll talk soon, bro.
Have a good one.
Later, everybody.